Hey guys! Tonight we begin with a long, slow drift back through time. So, go ahead and dim the lights. Pull the blankets up a little higher. Let your shoulders drop and just settle in. The modern world is loud and fast, and usually asking too much of you. But here, in the dark, we don't have to worry about any of that. We're just going to take a nice, slow stroll through 1,000 years of medieval history, a period where the most powerful people in the world were, quite frankly, just a collection of very tired, very confused individuals who probably shouldn't have been left in charge of a houseplant, let alone entire kingdoms. When we think of medieval Europe, the movies try to sell us on epic battles, gleaming armor, and dramatic speeches on horseback. But the reality of those 1,000 years was mostly just a long, awkward series of family reunions. Because, in the Middle Ages, the royal houses of Europe were essentially one giant, overly complicated family tree that looked more like a tangled ball of yarn. You didn't conquer your neighbors. You just married your cousin. And when that didn't work, you married your other cousin. Because why not double down? It was a time when diplomacy was conducted entirely through awkward weddings and pretending you didn't notice that your new spouse had the exact same nose as your uncle. So, as we glide back into this dim and dusty era, let's start by looking at what happened when all that careful, highly restricted matchmaking actually took the throne. Let's float over to France and check in on a man who really just needed a quiet room and a nap, but instead was given the French crown. I'm talking about Charles VI. Now, Charles is generally known to history as Charles the Mad, which is a bit harsh. But they weren't big on gentle medical diagnoses back in the 1300s. Charles actually started out fine. He was called Charles the Beloved early on, which is a nice title to have. He was young, he was wealthy, and he had a pretty standard royal life. But managing a kingdom during the 100 Years' War is stressful, and Charles did not handle stress particularly well. Instead of taking up a hobby, or perhaps delegating his workload, Charles's mind just sort of broke in slow motion. In his late 20s, Charles started having spells. During one particularly humid summer trip, a guy jumped out of the bushes and yelled at him, and Charles just snapped. But it's not the snapping that's interesting, it's how his brain decided to cope with reality for the rest of his life. After a while, Charles developed a very specific, very quiet delusion. He became entirely convinced that he was made of glass. Who's imagined that for a second? You are the King of France. You have people waiting on you hand and foot, knights ready to defend you, and you are absolutely terrified that if someone bumps into you too hard, you will shatter into a million pieces on the floor. It's a beautifully fragile way to exist. Charles would sit very, very still for hours. He had his tailors sew iron rods into the lining of his clothes. You know, just to reinforce his fragile glass torso, he wouldn't let anyone touch him. If a servant walked by a little too quickly, Charles would probably flinch, waiting for the sound of breaking glass. His court didn't really know what to do with him. They couldn't exactly unking him, because medieval rules didn't really account for a monarch made of antique glassware, so they just sort of let him be. They tiptoed around the palace. They spoke in hushed voices. In a way, Charles accidentally created the quietest, most peaceful royal court in Europe, simply because everyone was afraid of breaking the king. He would occasionally forget his own name, or forget that he was married, which must have been a little awkward for his wife. She would walk into the room, and he would look at her and casually ask his servants, "Who is this woman? And what does she want?" Just completely blanking on his marriage of several decades. It's sad, of course. But there's something wonderfully peaceful about just checking out of a war-torn century and deciding you are a decorative vase. Eventually, we have to leave the quiet, fragile corridors of France. Though, let's drift across the English Channel, into the equally damp and confusing world of the English monarchy. If Charles was made of glass, our next subject was essentially made of wet cardboard. Let's talk about Henry VI. Henry VI holds the impressive distinction of being the king who somehow managed to sleepwalk through his own reign. Henry inherited the throne when he was only 9 months old, which meant he spent his formative years sitting on a lap, while his uncles ran the country and argued over taxes. You would think that growing up surrounded by power-hungry nobles would turn you into a sharp, cynical politician, but not Henry. Henry just wanted to pray, stare at the wall, and maybe read a book if it wasn't too exciting. A was famously pious and hated violence, which is a lovely trait in a monk, but a terrible trait if you are the King of England during the Wars of the Roses. While the houses of York and Lancaster were busy, hacking each other to pieces over who got to wear the fancy hat, Henry was mostly just staring out the window, completely unbothered by the chaos. He would actually slip into catatonic states that lasted 4 months. Literally months. He wouldn't speak. He wouldn't move much. He wouldn't react. He was just a gentle, breathing paperweight sitting on the English throne. When his wife, Margaret of Anjou, was fierce and loud, and doing all the actual ruling, brought their newborn son to him, Henry just looked at the baby, smiled gently, and then looked away. He didn't say a word. He just lowered his eyes and went back to whatever quiet little world he was visiting in his head. Eventually, the rival factions captured him. But capturing Henry wasn't really a dramatic military achievement. You basically just walked up to him and said, "You're coming with us now," and Henry would probably just nod and follow along. They locked him in the Tower of London, but he didn't seem to mind. In fact, he probably preferred it. It was quiet. The rent was free. No one was asking him to sign trade agreements or lead armies. He had a little bird in a cage and a dog, and he just sat there, peacefully existing while the world burned down outside. He was eventually murdered while he was praying, which is a dark end. But knowing Henry, he probably barely noticed it happening. He just quietly faded out of a life he never really wanted to be part of. It's exhausting, really, trying to force these deeply unsuited people to run countries. And speaking of exhausting, let's slowly wander down to the Iberian Peninsula, where the Spanish royals were busy perfecting the art of emotional meltdowns. When you look at the ancestors of the Spanish Habsburgs, you find Joanna of Castile. Now, history decided to call her Joanna the Mad, or Juana la Loca, again with the harsh nicknames. But Joanna's story is less about clinical madness and more about a tragic, obsessive, completely exhausting love life. Juana was married off to Philip of Burgundy. Philip was known as Philip the Handsome, though if you look at his portraits today, he looks a bit like a half-baked Habsburg potato with a nice hat. But by the standards of the 1490s, where most royals looked like tired thumbs, Philip was considered a catch, and Joanna fell for him. The problem was, Philip was a terrible husband. He was constantly unfaithful, totally dismissive, and clearly just waiting for Joanna's parents to pass away so he could claim her inheritance. Joanna reacted to this by becoming incredibly jealous, which, of course, was a completely normal reaction to a Tuesday in that marriage. But she didn't just quietly seethe. She fully threw herself into the drama. She would bang on doors, scream in the courtyards, and generally make a massive, exhausting scene whenever Philip looked at another woman. But the real quiet weirdness began when Philip suddenly died of a fever at the age of 20. Joanna was devastated. Her mind just refused to accept that the handsome, terrible man she loved was gone. So she decided to just keep him around. When it was time to move his body to the royal burial site in Granada, Joanna didn't just send a carriage. She turned it into a bizarre, slow-motion road trip. She had his coffin packed up, and she traveled with it across Spain. But she only traveled at night because, as she supposedly reasoned, a widow who had lost the son of her life should never see the daylight again. So, picture this. A long, silent procession winding through the dusty hills of Spain under the moonlight. Just a grief-stricken queen, a bunch of very tired monks chanting softly, and a wooden box containing Philip the Handsome, who was decidedly less handsome as the weeks went by. She was so paranoid that other women would try to steal him of in though he was, deceased that she refused to let the procession stop at any monasteries were fine, but no nuns were allowed near the box. She would occasionally have the coffin opened, just to gaze at him and make sure he was still there. Her father eventually had to step in and gently lock her away in a convent in Tordesillas, where she spent the next 5 decades just staring out of a window, wearing black, and refusing to bathe. It is deeply tragic, but it's also just such a slow, heavy, draining way to live. A whole lifetime spent dragging the past behind you, quite literally in a box. And that is really the theme of these medieval centuries. People trapped in golden cages, forced into roles they couldn't handle, reacting in the strangest, quietest ways possible. Take, for instance, a man who wasn't necessarily mad, but was just remarkably bad at everything he attempted. Let's float back up north, to the damp bogs of England, and look at King John. You'll probably know King John from the Robin Hood stories, where he's an evil, scheming lion or a shouting tyrant. The real King John wasn't really an evil genius. He was mostly just petty, easily annoyed, and cursed with terrible luck and bad decision-making skills. He spent most of his reign trying to prove he was a tough guy, and mostly just alienating everyone he ever met. But the absolute peak of John's miserable, quiet disasters happened right at the end of his life. John was traveling across England, trying to put down a rebellion that he himself had basically caused by being so annoying. He had all his stuff with him. And by all his stuff, I mean the royal treasury, carts and carts full of gold, silver, jewels, and his personal fancy clothes. It was crossing an area known as the Wash, which is a massive tidal estuary. Now, the thing about tidal estuaries is that the tide comes in. This is a fairly well-known fact, but John, or at least his baggage handlers, apparently thought they could outrun it. So they send the baggage train across the wet sands. And, of course, they miscalculated. Imaginez, standing on a cold, gray shoreline in the mist. There's no dramatic battle. There's no clashing of swords. Just the quiet, wet-sucking sound of mud. John had to stand there and simply watch as the water slowly rolled in, trapping the carts. The horses panicked. The wheels sank. And over the course of a few hours, the entire royal treasury of England just quietly slurped down into the muck. Gone all his shiny crowns, all his coins, just swallowed by a swamp. John was so incredibly depressed by this that he rode off to a nearby abbey, ate what was apparently a massive, concerning amount of fresh peat, drank too much cider, contracted dysentery, and died. It is the most underwhelming end to a reign you could possibly script. He lost his luggage in a puddle, gave himself a stomachache, and just gave up. Let's just float. Oberto Latte 14th Thursday century, Central Europe. Wenceslas had a very difficult childhood, mostly because his father was Charles IV, and Charles IV was one of those exhausting, high-achieving overachievers. Charles practically built the city of Prague by himself, founded universities, wrote laws, and generally bounded around Europe being terribly effective. Being the son of a man like that is tiring just to think about. You're expected to inherit this massive, complicated empire, which wasn't even a real empire so much as a loose, squabbling collection of angry German princes and stubborn Bohemian nobles. Wenceslas looked at this inheritance, looked at the heavy administrative burden of existing, and collectively decided, no. Thank you, and story calls him Wenceslas, the idol, which is a wonderfully passive-aggressive nickname. He wasn't evil. He didn't start massive, pointless wars. Ejustriali really didn't want to work. He liked hunting. He liked his dogs. He liked drinking an impressive amount of Bohemian beer. And he absolutely hated doing paperwork. When Wenceslas was elected King of the Romans, which was the stepping stone to becoming the Holy Roman Emperor, he was supposed to travel down to Rome to be officially crowned by the Pope. This was standard procedure, a big, shiny road trip to Italy. But Wenceslas just kept postponing it. He'd say he was busy. He'd say the roads were muddy. For years, he just stayed in his hunting lodges in the woods, ignoring his royal duties. Princes would travel for weeks to ask him to settle a dispute, and Wenceslas would simply lock the door and refuse to come out. Imagine being a powerful, heavily armed duke standing in the muddy courtyard of a hunting lodge, being told by a tired servant that the emperor can't come to the door right now because he is busy hanging out with his hounds. It was a completely quiet, slow-motion disaster. Eventually, the princes of the empire got so incredibly annoyed with him that they actually held a meeting and formally fired him. In the year 1400, they essentially drafted a medieval pink slip, declaring that Wenceslas was useless, neglectful, and entirely unfit for the job. they deposed him. And the best part? Wenceslas didn't even really fight it. He just shrugged, stayed in Bohemia, and kept hunting. He lost the most prestigious title in Europe, and his reaction was essentially a relieved sigh. He just wanted to be left alone in the woods, and honestly, looking at the state of medieval politics, you really can't blame him. That's sometimes when a monarch retreats from reality. They don't just go hunting. Sometimes they drag the rest of the court into a delusion so dark and so awkward that it makes Wenceslas's lazy afternoons look perfectly healthy. Let's drift south, down to the warm, dusty coasts of Portugal in the mid-1300s. And look at King Pedro. The first Pedro's story is a heavy, slow tragedy about a man who just could not let go. Pedro was the heir to the throne, and like all good medieval princes, he was forced to marry a woman for political reasons. Her name was but Pedro, inconveniently, fell completely and obsessively in love with Constanza's lady-in-waiting, a woman named Inés de Castro. It wasn't a secret. It made dinners terribly awkward. Pedro practically ignored his wife, and spent all his time with Inés. His father, King Afonso IV, was not happy about this. Afonso was a very practical, unsentimental man who viewed Pedro's love life as a massive diplomatic liability. So, when Pedro was out of town, King Afonso did what medieval kings do when they want to solve a human resources problem. He sent 3 men to quietly murder Inés. When Pedro found out, his heart just sort of turned to stone. He went to war against his own father for a bit, which was exhausting, before his mother finally forced them to sign a peace treaty. Shortly after, Afonso died of old age, and Pedro finally became king of Portugal. Now Pedro did track down the assassins, and he dealt with them in a way that was rather messy and deeply unpleasant. So we'll just quietly skip right over the details of that. Instead, let's look at what he did next, which is where the story shifts from a standard revenge plot into a slow, macabre piece of performance art. Pedro announced that he and Inés had been secretly married years ago, which meant she was technically the rightful queen of Portugal. But, of course, Inés had been dead for quite some time. For Pedro, this was just a minor administrative hurdle. According to legend, and it's a legend that has survived because it perfectly captures the deep, unyielding stubbornness of royal grief. Pedro ordered her body to be exhumed from her quiet grave in Coimbra. He had her remains dressed in the finest royal robes, heavy, velvet, gold-trimmed fabrics draped over brittle bone. He placed her on a throne beside him in the great hall. He put a crown on her skull, and then he summoned all the nobles of the court. The very same nobles who had looked down on her when she was alive, the ones who had whispered behind her back and supported her murder. Picture that scene, a drafty, echoing stone hall, lit by flickering candlelight, a long line of nervous, incredibly uncomfortable Portuguese aristocrats shuffling forward in the silence. One by one, they had to walk up to the throne, kneel on the cold floor, and kiss the decomposing, skeletal hand of the dead queen, swearing their loyalty to her. It wasn't violent. It was just profoundly, inescapably awkward. A quiet, heavy revenge. Pedro forced his entire court to participate in his grief, wrapping them in this bizarre, morbid ceremony just to prove a point. He eventually built her a beautiful, intricately carved tomb, and had his own tomb placed opposite hers, so that on Judgment Day, the first thing they would see when they woke up was each other. It's romantic, in a deeply unsettling, gothic sort of way. A love story wrapped in velvet and dust. From the dark, candlelit throne rooms of Portugal, let's float all the way back up to the cold, grey waters of the north, to the Baltic Sea, where another monarch was dealing with the crushing weight of his crown, but decided to handle it in a way that was entirely unique. He didn't go mad. He didn't commune with the dead. He just quit his job and became a pirate. I'm talking about King Eric of Pomerania. Eric had perhaps the most difficult job description of the 15th century. He was the king of the Kalmar Union, which meant he was simultaneously the king of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. He ruled over this massive, freezing expanse of forests, fjords, and extremely stubborn people. He inherited this empire from his great-aunt, Margaret I, who was a terrifyingly competent woman. Margaret had stitched these three rival kingdoms together through sheer force of will, and when she died, she handed the keys to Eric, expecting him to keep the car running. Eric tried. He really did. He spent decades traveling through the snow, arguing with Swedish nobles who hated paying taxes to a Danish king. He fought long, slow, boring trade wars with the Hanseatic League over who got to control the herring market. Because nothing screams majestic medieval warfare quite like a blockade over salted fish. Year after year, the Swedish nobles rebelled. The Danish nobles complained. The Norwegian nobles just sat in the cold and grumbled. Eric was constantly trying to put out fires across a territory that took months to travel across, and by the time he reached his late 50s, Eric was just completely burned out. Around 1439, Eric essentially woke up one morning, looked at his schedule of meetings, looked at the piles of complaints from angry counts and bishops, and decided he had had enough. He didn't abdicate formally. He didn't name a successor. He just quietly packed up the royal treasury, because if you're going to quit, you might as well take the silver with you, boarded his ships, and sailed away. It went to the island of Gotland. Gotland is a small, rocky island sitting right in the middle of the Baltic Sea. There was a fortress there called Vis. Eric moved in, locked the doors, and simply refused to be king anymore. Bike. On the mainland, the nobles were confused. They sent letters. They sent envoys. They practically stood on the shores of Sweden, squinting out across the grey water, asking him to please come back and do his job. But Eric ignored them. Was done. But a man has to eat, and maintaining a fortress on a rocky island isn't cheap. So Eric, the former king of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, took up a new hobby. He became a pirate. He used his small fleet to hijack merchant ships that were sailing through the Baltic. And the beautiful irony of this is that the ships he was raiding often belonged to his own former subjects, or the Hanseatic merchants he used to negotiate with. Imagine being a merchant captain, getting boarded by a group of scruffy men, and realizing the guy stealing your crates of wool and salted cod is your former monarch. Eric spent 10 years on that island, 10 years just sitting on a rock, watching the seagulls, occasionally stealing a boat. Completely ignoring the collapse of the Union he had spent his whole life trying to hold together. It was the ultimate medieval midlife crisis. He eventually got bored of that too, handed the castle over, and retired to a quiet estate in Pomerania, where he lived out the rest of his days in total obscurity. It is such a gentle, amusing collapse of authority. No grand battles, no tragic executions, just a tired middle-aged man who decided that running a kingdom was too stressful, and that being a pirate on a rock sounded a lot more relaxing. When we think of medieval kings, we expect a certain level of aggressive ambition. We expect shouting and sword-waving, and riding very fast on very large horses. But let's float over to England in the early 14th century and look at a man who found all of that completely repulsive. I am talking about King Edward II. Edward had the extreme misfortune of being the son of Edward I. His father, famously known as Edward Longshanks, was a terrifying, towering man who spent his entire life hammering the Scots and the Welsh into submission. He was loud, he was violent, and he was deeply, fundamentally exhausting to be around. So, naturally, his son grew up wanting to do absolutely nothing that his father did. When Edward II finally inherited the throne, the barons of England expected him to put on a suit of armor and go terrorize the neighbors. Instead, Edward looked at the royal armory, sighed, and decided he would rather take up arts and crafts. Edward didn't want to be a king. He wanted to be a peasant, and not in a cute, metaphorical way. He genuinely enjoyed manual labor. While the lords of his realm were busy practicing jousting and plotting complex political alliances, the King of England was out in the mud, digging ditches. He loved it. He found it incredibly relaxing. He would spend hours just shoveling dirt, probably enjoying the quiet repetition of it all. When he wasn't digging ditches, he was learning how to thatch roofs. Imagine being a powerful English earl. You have ridden for 3 days through the freezing rain to discuss a vital treaty with France. You arrive at the royal estate, exhausted and demanding an audience, and you are told by a nervous servant that the king cannot see you right now because he is on top of a barn, tying bundles of straw together. It drove the nobility absolutely out of their minds. They considered it deeply embarrassing. Kings were supposed to be anointed by God to lead armies, not to do the plumbing. But Edward didn't care. He liked rowing boats. He liked swimming in cold rivers. He liked hanging out with his favorite companion, a guy named Piers Gaveston, and just ignoring the massive, creaking machinery of the English government. Edward would give Gaveston all the best royal titles, simply because he liked him, which is a terrible way to run a feudal society. The barons would complain, Edward would ignore them, and then he would probably go back to his masonry. Eventually, the nobility got so tired of watching their monarch act like a remarkably well-dressed bricklayer that they rebelled. They captured Gaveston, which was tragic, and eventually they came for Edward. His own wife, Isabella of Francois, was decidedly not a fan of ditch-digging teamed up with a nobleman to quietly depose him, and in the true, sleepy fashion of this era, Edward didn't go down in a blaze of glory. He just sorta gave up. He handed over the crown, probably feeling a massive sense of relief, and was sent away to a damp castle in the countryside. The history books have some very dramatic, rather horrific rumors about how he finally died, but the truth is likely much quieter. He was just a guy who wanted to do yard work, crushed by the weight of a job he never applied for. Let's leave timidity ditches of England behind and slowly drift back in time and east across the continent to the 9th century. If Edward was avoiding his job by picking up a shovel, our next monarch was avoiding his job by simply being too tired to stand up. Let's talk about Charles the Fat. Charles was a member of the Carolingian dynasty. He was the great-grandson of Charlemagne. Now, Charlemagne was another one of those hyperactive empire-building overachievers. He conquered most of Western Europe and created a massive, complicated empire that required constant maintenance. By the time the family tree branched down to Charles the Fat, the empire was splintered, and the family genetics were, frankly, looking a little worn out. Charles didn't conquer his empire. He didn't fight great battles to unite the lands. He just happened to be the last man standing in a family that was incredibly prone to catching medieval fevers and dropping dead. One by one, his brothers, his cousins, and his nephews all conveniently expired from various illnesses or riding accidents. And with every funeral, Charles inherited another piece of the map. He inherited Italy, then Germany, then France, until, completely by accident, he had reunited almost the entire empire of Charlemagne. The problem was, Charles was sick. He was chronically lethargic. He suffered from debilitating headaches that left him practically immobilized, and he likely had a form of epilepsy. He was just heavy and tired, and in pain most of the time. And suddenly, he was the Emperor of the West. The timing could not have been worse, because while Charles was sitting in a drafty palace, holding his head and wishing everyone would just be quiet, the Vikings were busy becoming a massive, violent problem. In the year 885, a massive Viking fleet sailed up the Seine River and laid siege to Paris. The people of Paris locked the gates, manned the walls, and sent desperate, frantic letters to their emperor, begging him to come and save them. They held out 4 months. They starved, they fought, they waited for the shiny, heroic arrival of the Carolingian army. Eventually Charles did arrive. He brought a massive army with him. He camped on the hill of Montmartre, looking down at the Viking camp and looking down at the battered city of Paris. The Parisians cheered. The Vikings prepared for a brutal battle, and Charles Dust went to his tent and took a nap. Didn't want to fight. Fighting involved yelling and moving around, and it would probably make his headache worse. So, in perhaps the most anticlimactic military maneuver in medieval history, Charles simply sent a messenger to the Viking warlord and offered him a bribe. It basically said, "Look, I have 700 pounds of silver. If I give this to you, will you just go away?" The Vikings, who were very practical businessmen, agreed. But Charles didn't stop there. He also told the Vikings that if they wanted to do some more raiding, they could go pillage the region of Burgundy, because the Burgundians had been annoying him lately anyway. The people of Paris were absolutely stunned. They had spent a year eating rats and defending the empire, and their emperor just paid the enemy to take a vacation in the next province. It was a massive, quiet betrayal. But for Charles, it was just the easiest administrative solution to a noisy problem. Unsurprisingly, this completely ruined his reputation. His nobles, much like Wenceslaus's nobles, eventually realized that their emperor was essentially a large, heavily armed throw pillow. A few years later, his nephew raised an army and challenged him for the throne. Charles didn't even put up a fight. He didn't assemble his loyalists. A Hustiged accepted that he was fired and asked if he could please go to an estate in Swabia and be left alone. Te seid end. He went there and died quietly a few months later, just a very tired man who finally got to go to sleep. It is remarkable how often the end of a medieval reign is not marked by a sword, but by a bowl of soup. Let's float back over to France, to the 15th century, and check in on King Charles VII. You might know Charles VII from the story of Joan of Arc. He was the young, disinherited Dauphin who was feeling very sorry for himself until Joan showed up, told him to stand up straight, and helped him get crowned King of France. And for a while, Charles did okay. He actually managed to win the 100 Years' War, mostly by letting other, more competent people do the fighting. But as he got older, the quiet, creeping weirdness of royal life began to take its toll. Charles was a naturally anxious person, and in the last years of his life, his anxiety crystallized into a dark, suffocating paranoia. Charles had a son, the future Louis XI, and Louis hated his father. They bickered constantly, mostly over power and money, until Louis eventually just left the court and moved to a different region, openly waiting for his father to die. Charles knew this, and sitting in his quiet, heavily guarded castle, Charles began to obsess over it. He convinced himself that Louis had paid off the royal cooks. He was absolutely certain that his own son was trying to poison his food. Now, kings worrying about poison was nothing new. That's why food tasters were a booming industry in the Middle Ages. But Charles's paranoia went deeper than just making someone else eat his bread first. In the summer of 1461, Charles developed a nasty infection in his mouth. Some historians think it was an abscess, or perhaps jaw cancer. Whatever it was, it made eating uncomfortable. But the physical pain was secondary to the mental wall he had built. He looked at the food. His servants brought him the rich broths, the roasted meats, the wine, and all he saw was death. So, because he was so terrified of being murdered, Charles decided the safest course of action was to just stop eating entirely. It is a slow, agonizing irony. To avoid dying, he chose to starve. Day after day, the most powerful man in France sat in his opulent, velvet-lined bedchamber, staring at trays of food, and refusing to open his mouth. His doctors pleaded with him. His courtiers begged him. They tried to force-feed him, but he just turned his head away. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't a religious fast. It was just a quiet, unyielding panic. For over a week, he sat there, slowly fading away into the heavy silence of his room, completely trapped inside his own mind. He withered down to almost nothing, consumed entirely by his own suspicion, until his body simply gave out. It died in July, killed not by his ambitious son, and not by English arrows, but by the overwhelming, exhausting fear of his own dinner, because nothing says divine right to rule quite like a grown man terrified of his own soup. Ites. Just another quiet tragedy in a long, unbroken string of them. Another monarch who found that wearing a crown didn't protect you from the strange, fragile mechanics of your own brain. Throughout this journey, we've seen monarchs try to escape their duties by digging ditches, by becoming pirates, or by simply taking very long naps while their kingdoms burned. But sometimes, the tragedy wasn't that a king didn't want to rule. Sometimes, the tragedy was that they physically and psychologically couldn't perform the one single, absolute requirement of a medieval monarch. Producing an heir, let us drift down to the warm, dusty plains of Spain in the mid-1400s and look at King Henry IV of Castile. Now, if you thought history was harsh for calling a man Charles the Fat or Joanna the Mad, Henry's historical nickname is just a spectacular, permanent embarrassment. He is known forever in the official records as Henry the Imp. Henry was a quiet, sad man who really just liked animals. He loved his hunting dogs, he kept a menagerie of exotic beasts, and he actively despised the loud, violent, macho culture of the Castilian nobility. He would much rather be out in the woods feeding a deer than sitting in a throne room negotiating with a shouting duke. But he was the king, which meant he had to get married. At the age of 15, he was married off to Blanche of Navarre, and for 13 incredibly awkward years, they shared a castle, shared a court, and produced absolutely nothing. In the medieval world, an unconsummated marriage was a massive political crisis. The whispering in the court must have been deafening. The nobility, who already disliked Henry for being soft-spoken and avoiding wars, began to spread rumors. Ibn Tuaji. Henry needed an out. He needed the marriage annulled, but he couldn't just admit that things weren't working. So, he claimed that he had been cursed by local witches, and not a general curse, mind you. He specifically claimed that the witchcraft only affected his ability to be intimate with Blanche, and that if he were married to literally anyone else, he would be perfectly fine. It was the 15th century equivalent of saying, "It's not me. It's a highly localized, magically induced allergy to my wife." The Pope, who probably just wanted the paperwork off his desk, granted the so Henry married again. This time to Joan of Portugal. And for a few years, the quiet, heavy tension continued. Nothing happened. Henry spent all of his time with his favorite courtier, a handsome, highly capable knight named Beltran de la Cueva. Henry gave Beltran titles, lands, and practically let him run the kingdom while Henry played with his dogs. Then miraculously, Queen Joan announced she was pregnant. She gave birth to a daughter named Juana. You would think this would be a moment of triumph for Henry. But the Castilian court took one look at the baby, took one look at the handsome Beltran de la Cueva, and universally decided, yeah, that's Beltran's kid. They didn't even try to hide their disdain. They literally named the baby Juana La Beltrane Juana, the daughter of Imagine being the king of Castile, finally getting the heir you've spent 20 years trying to produce, and your entire kingdom just slowly shakes their heads and laughs at you. Henry tried to fight it. He tried to force the nobles to swear loyalty to his daughter, but he didn't have the energy for a civil war. He was too tired, too sad, and too busy avoiding conflict. Eventually, his own sister, Isabellius, that Isabella, the one who would later fund Christopher Columbus, pushed him aside, allied with the angry nobles, and took the throne for herself. Henry just sort of faded into the background, a man who was entirely unsuited for the brutal, biological mechanics of medieval royalty, spending his final days wandering his quiet estates, probably wishing he had just been born a zookeeper. But Henry's dynastic struggles were just a prelude, a gentle warning of what happens when a handful of families spend 1,000 years refusing to marry anyone outside of their own very small, very elite, very restricted social circle. To close our eyes on this era, we have to look at the ultimate, tragic conclusion of the European marriage market. We are going to drift just slightly past the strict boundaries of the Middle Ages into the late 1600s, because to understand the medieval obsession with royal bloodlines, you have to see how it ends. You have to see Charles II of Spain. By the time Charles was born, the Spanish Habsburgs had been marrying their cousins, and their nieces, and their uncles for over a century. Their family tree didn't branch. It just wove back in on itself until it looked like a dense, tangled wreath. And Charles was the final, unfortunate blossom on that wreath. Charles is known as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, because the people of Spain, looking at their deeply unwell king, decided that the only logical explanation for his existence was dark magic. They didn't understand genetics. They didn't understand that if you play an exclusive biological game of matching pairs for 100 years, eventually, the whole deck collapses. Charles was, simply put, a physical disaster. He was essentially a human jigsaw puzzle, where the pieces didn't quite fit together, and half of them were missing entirely. He had the famous Habsburg jaw, but in Charles, it was so pronounced that his upper and lower teeth couldn't meet, which meant he couldn't chew his food. He had to swallow everything whole, which led to a lifetime of terrible, agonizing stomach issues. His tongue was reportedly too large for his mouth, making his speech a thick, heavily slurred mumble that only his closest servants could even begin to translate. Ed didn't learn to walk until he was 8 years old. He didn't receive an education, because his tutors and doctors were entirely focused on just keeping him breathing from one day to the next. He wasn't mad, like Charles of France. He wasn't willfully idle, like Wenceslas. He was just fundamentally, biologically exhausted from the moment he was born. His life was a long, slow, velvet-draped tragedy. He was the ruler of a global empire, and he spent most of his days just playing with dwarfs and hunting dogs in the dimly lit corridors of the Alcazar Palace. He was a gentle soul. By all accounts, he was deeply pious, very trusting, and desperately sad. He knew he was the last of his line. He knew he couldn't produce an heir. He was married twice, 2 women who were brought in from across Europe to try and squeeze one last miracle out of the Habsburg genes. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, fell into a deep depression when she realized the reality of her new husband and the crushing, gloomy atmosphere of the Spanish court. She died young, and Charles was devastated. His second wife, Maria Ona of New, basically just ignored him and spent her time arguing with his ministers over who would get the empire when he inevitably expired. And Charles knew they were waiting for him to die. Imagine the quiet horror of that, wandering through your massive, drafty palaces, surrounded by grand paintings of your armored ancestors, knowing that you are the dead end, knowing that the doctors who bleed you, the priests who perform bizarre exorcisms on you, because again, they thought it was witchcraft, and the ambassadors who bow to you are all just holding their breath, waiting for the clock to run out. When Charles finally died, at the age of the physician who performed his autopsy wrote a report that reads less like a medical document and more like a Gothic poem. The doctor noted that Charles's body contained almost no blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were and his head was full of water. It was as if his body had just given up on the basic concept of living. He was a ghost long before he actually stopped breathing. And with his final, quiet exhale, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty simply vanished into the dust. 1,000 years of careful, calculated, ruthless medieval matchmaking, culminating in a sad, gentle man who just wanted to play with his dogs and couldn't even chew his own dinner. And so we leave them there. We leave the fragile glass kings, the tired emperors, the accidental pirates, and the victims of their own tangled bloodlines. The Middle Ages were loud and brutal and full of iron and fire. But the people at the very top of it all were mostly just trapped. Trapped in heavy clothes, trapped in drafty castles, and trapped by the unbearable expectations of a world that viewed them as property rather than people. So as the last candle gutters out, and the tapestries fade into the shadows, be glad for your own quiet, boring, beautifully uncomplicated life. You don't have to marry your cousin to secure a trade route. You don't have to worry about your soup being poisoned by your ambitious children. You can just pull the covers up, let the dark settle in, and sleep good night. Now we are looking at something a little bit bizarre. We usually spend a lot of time talking about the deeply uncomfortable family trees of European monarchs. And trust me, we will get to some royal dysfunction shortly. But first, we need to talk about medieval mystery plays. It sounds like a genre where a monk solves a murder in a dusty abbey, but it really wasn't. It was much, much weirder. Let's just float over to 14th century England for a moment. Imagine, if you will, a gloomy, damp cobblestone street. It is 4:30 in the morning. The sun isn't even up yet, but the entire town is awake, standing in the cold, waiting for a giant wooden box on wheels to slowly rumble down the street. This was the pageant wagon. The mystery in mystery plays didn't mean a puzzle. It came from the Latin word mysterium, which basically meant a trade or a craft. These plays were massive, sprawling, chaotic theatrical events put on entirely by local trade guilds. Think of it like a modern corporate team-building exercise, but mandatory, heavily intertwined with religious salvation, and completely lacking in health and safety regulations. The guilds were the absolute masters of the medieval middle class. These were the butchers, the bakers, the candlestick makers, and they had egos that could easily rival any inbred Habsburg duke. Each guild was assigned a specific story from the Bible to perform, and they took it incredibly seriously, mostly because they hated the other guilds and wanted to show them up. There was a lot of very on-the-nose casting. The shipwrights, the guys who built boats, naturally got assigned the story of Noah and the Ark. Because, of course they did, they've got to show off their woodworking skills. On a rolling stage, the bakers were usually given the Last Supper, so they could showcase their bread, and the Penursta guys who made nails and metal pins were inevitably assigned the crucifixion, which is, frankly, a very dark form of medieval corporate sponsorship. They were basically saying, brought to you by the Pinners Guild. Our nails get the job done. These guilds would spend absurd amounts of money on these plays. They would tax their members, fine people for not showing up to rehearsals, and generally act like absolute tyrants. Surviving guild records from places like York and Chester are just lists of petty grievances. We have records of actors being fined to shillings for not knowing their lines, or for showing up to play an angel while aggressively hungover. Because nothing really ruins the illusion of divine grace quite like an angel, smelling like cheap medieval ale, and quietly vomiting behind a wooden cloud. The stages themselves were called pageant wagons. These were massive, two-story wooden carts. The bottom half was usually curtained off, so the actors could change clothes, or hide, or drink more ale. The top half was the stage. They had to drag these heavy, unwieldy wooden carts through the narrow, muddy, disgusting streets of medieval cities. They didn't just perform the play once. They would stop at designated stations throughout the town, perform their 15-minute scene, and then manually push the giant wagon to the next stop, while the next guild's wagon rolled in to take their place. If you lived in a town like York, which had about 48 different plays in its cycle, you would literally just stand in one spot from 4:30 in the morning until late at night, watching an endless parade of amateur theater slowly roll past you. It was exhausting, and the logistics were a nightmare. Wagons would get stuck in the mud. Wheels would break. There would be traffic jams of biblical proportions, where Moses would be stuck behind Adam and Eve, screaming at them to move their wagon faster. Now, you might be wondering, did the royalty care about any of this? Of course they did, because if there was one thing a medieval monarch loved, it was people spending their own money to put on a massive spectacle in their honor. Let's look at King Richard II of England. Richard was a lot. He was deeply obsessed with his own image, completely paranoid, and entirely convinced of his absolute divine right to rule. He was the kind of king who invented the handkerchief just so he could delicately dab his nose while looking down at people. In 1397, Richard decided to visit York to watch the mystery plays. The town went into an absolute panic. They had to impress a king who was notoriously moody and prone to executing people who annoyed him. Richard sat in a specially built, heavily draped, royal viewing box. Imagine him, draped in velvet, probably looking a bit like a highly decorated, very tired bird. He sat there for hours, watching local blacksmiths and fishmongers stumble through heavy religious drama. The guilds actually went out of their way to add extra flattering lines about kingship into the plays just for him. Because when a volatile, slightly narcissistic monarch is watching your amateur play, you pander. You pander as hard as you can. But Richard's presence just made the dysfunction worse. The guilds were so nervous that actors kept forgetting their lines. The massive wagons were taking too long to move because the crowds were too busy staring at the king to get out of the way. Richard, to his credit, just sat there, occasionally nodding, entirely removed from reality, probably just happy that everyone was forced to stand in the mud while he had a cushioned chair. And then you have characters like King Henry VI, who came along a bit later. Henry was famously fragile. He was sad, sickly, and suffered from severe mental breakdowns that left him completely catatonic for months at a time. The poor guy really had no business being a king. He was entirely too gentle, inherited a disastrous war in France, and was surrounded by ambitious nobles, who basically used him as a heavily crowned pawn. When Henry VI watched these plays, he wasn't looking for political flattery like Richard II. He was deeply, almost obsessively pious. He would sit and watch the plays with absolute, unblinking sincerity, while the rest of the crowd was laughing at the bad acting or tossing rotten food at the guy playing the devil. Henry was probably just quietly weeping at the spiritual beauty of a local butcher, badly reciting verses about salvation. It's a very sad, very quiet image. A deeply traumatized king finding a little bit of peace in the chaotic, badly rehearsed theater of his peasants. You couldn't have a mystery play without special effects, and the absolute pinnacle of medieval stagecraft was the Helmuth. The Helmuth was exactly what it sounds like. It was a giant, mechanical prop, shaped like the head of a terrifying beast or a dragon, representing the entrance to hell. The jaws were designed to physically open and close. Inside the Helmuth, hidden from the audience, were a couple of unlucky guild members whose entire job was to make it look scary. They would burn pitch, sulfur, and eventually gunpowder to create thick, terrible-smelling smoke that would billow out of the mouth. Then, the actors playing demons would leap out. The demons were always the crowd favorites, while the actors playing God or the angels had to stand very still and speak in slow, boring, reverent tones. The demons got to go completely feral. They wore hideous masks, animal skins, and carried clubs. They would run into the crowd, scream at people, steal their hats, and generally just cause a nuisance. But the Helmuth was incredibly dangerous. You had a giant contraption made of dried wood, canvas, and paint, and you filled it with open flames, exploding gunpowder, and highly flammable animal fat. Disasters were basically guaranteed. There are plenty of dry, monotonous town records, noting that the Helmuth caught fire, a gyno, or that the guy playing Satan had to be pulled out of the jaw because his costume was actively melting. They never stopped the play for long, though they would just put the actor out, maybe give him a slightly damp rag, and push him back out onto the stage, because the schedule was tight, and the fishmongers were waiting their turn. It was a world of pure, unadulterated commitment to the bit. You have to respect the absolute dedication of a medieval baker who is willing to suffer second-degree burns on a Tuesday afternoon just to make sure. The town of Chester gets a realistic depiction of eternal damnation. Eventually, these plays started to die out as the decades rolled on and the religious landscape of Europe shifted with the Reformation, having heavily armed local guilds putting on wildly inaccurate and slightly unhinged biblical plays started to seem less like a fun civic duty, and more like a massive political liability. Monarchs like Henry VIII and later Elizabeth I didn't find them quaint or pious. They found them suspicious. They started censoring the scripts, banning certain guilds, and slowly bleeding the life out of the tradition. The roll-in death traps were broken down and sold for scrap wood. The intricate demon masks were tossed away. But for a few centuries, the mystery plays were the absolute center of the world for these towns. A beautiful, muddy, exhausting mix of genuine faith and incredibly petty local rivalry, watched over by kings who were either entirely too full of themselves or entirely lost in their own minds. We are going to pause right there for a moment. Let the image of the smoldering Helmuth fade away into the cool night air. Would you like me to continue with part 2, exploring the disastrous love lives and weird dietary habits of the royalty who funded these chaotic spectacles? Let's start in the late 15th century with a woman named Joanna of Castile. You might know her by her historical nickname, Joanna the Mad. Though, honestly, given the people she was surrounded by, her reactions to life were arguably quite reasonable. Joanna was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the ones who funded Columbus. She was arranged to marry a man named Philip. Historically, he is known as Philip the Handsome, but if you look at his surviving portraits, you have to wonder who was doing the grading. He looked less like a breathtaking heartthrob and more like a somewhat surprised, half-baked Habsburg potato. He had heavy eyelids, a long nose, and an expression that permanently suggested he was trying to remember where he left his favorite hat. But Joanna fell deeply, obsessively in love with him. Philip, in return, was thoroughly mediocre. He was entirely unbothered by her affection, frequently unfaithful, and mostly just interested in securing his own political power in Spain. When Philip died suddenly in 1506 of a fever, Joanna's grief was absolute, and this is where the story usually gets sensationalized. But let's just look at the slow, quiet reality of it. Joanna did not just bury her husband and move on. She decided that Philip needed to be moved to a royal resting place in Granada, which was in the deep south of Spain. So, she packed his lead-lined coffin onto a cart and started walking. Just picture it. It's the dead of winter in the Spanish countryside. It is freezing. The roads are terrible, and there is a massive royal procession walking at a glacial pace behind a creaking cart carrying a deceased archduke. Joanna insisted on traveling only at night. She said that a widow who had lost the son of her life should not be exposed to the light of day. It's poetic, sure, but for the hundreds of courtiers, priests, and guards forced to stumble through the freezing mud at 3 a.m. holding candles, it was just exhausting. Joanna was also extremely paranoid. At one point, the procession stopped at a convent to rest, but when Joanna realized it was a convent filled with nuns, she panicked. She was terrified that even in death, other women would somehow tempt Philip away from her. So she ordered the entire exhausted procession back out into the freezing night, moving the coffin to a nearby courtyard and standing guard over it herself. It was just a deeply sad, slightly unhygienic royal road trip. It wasn't scary. It was just a long, cold exercise in emotional meltdown, watched by courtiers who were too polite and too heavily armed to intervene. Eventually, her father stepped in, took control of the kingdom, and quietly locked Joanna away in a windowless castle in Tordesillas, where she stayed for the next 50 years, wearing black, refusing to bathe, and slowly fading into the heavy stone walls. Joanna and Philip were the beginning of the Spanish Habsburg line, and the Habsburgs had a very specific philosophy about marriage. They believed their bloodline was a highly exclusive club. It was so exclusive, in fact, that they eventually stopped inviting new people entirely. Because why not double down on the same 4 grandparents? Over the next 2 centuries, the Habsburgs married their cousins, their nieces, and their uncles, with a kind of dull, bureaucratic dedication. They were trying to keep their lands united, but all they managed to do was severely confuse their own DNA. This brings us, inevitably, to the final Spanish Habsburg, King Charles II of Spain. Let's just glide over to the late 17th century. Charles II was a human genetic bottleneck. He was the product of hundreds of years of royal inbreeding. His father and his mother were uncle and niece. All 8 of his great-grandparents were descendants of the same 2 people, Joanna and Philip. Charles didn't just have a family tree. He had a family wreath. The most famous physical trait of this family was the Habsburg jaw severe, underbite, where the lower jaw protruded so far out that the upper and lower teeth couldn't meet. But by the time we get to Charles, it wasn't just a quirk. It was a structural tragedy. He was a king made entirely of recycled DNA. He didn't just have the Habsburg jaw. He was the Habsburg jaw, with a person attached as a frail, exhausted afterthought. His jaw was so pronounced that he physically could not chew his food, which brings us to his daily routine. Imagine being the king of the largest global empire on Earth, and your biggest daily challenge is trying to defeat a bowl of soup. Charles's dietary habits were a tragedy of physics. Because he couldn't chew, he had to swallow all of his food whole, or eat things that were boiled into a gray, flavorless mush. Unsurprisingly, his digestion was an absolute nightmare. He spent most of his life suffering from severe stomach cramps, quietly sitting in his heavily gilded palace, wondering why everything hurt. He was also chronically sick, prone to seizures, and entirely incapable of having children. The court physicians, who were essentially just guessing at medicine while wearing very expensive velvet robes, had no idea what to do with him. They blamed witchcraft. Of course, they did. It was easier to say the king was cursed by demons than to admit that marrying your uncle might have biological consequences. So, instead of a balanced diet or, perhaps, a genetically diverse wife, Charles was subjected to bizarre treatments. They tried everything. We have records of them applying freshly killed pigeons to his head to draw out the bad humors. Just imagine this poor, tired, constantly confused man sitting in a dark room, trying to digest unchewed boiled meat, while a royal doctor solemnly places a deceased bird on his forehead. Charles didn't do much ruling. He mostly just survived, day by day. A sad, sickly, spoiled king who was incredibly gentle and mostly just wanted to be left alone, playing with his court dwarfs and his dogs. When he finally passed away at the age of 38, the autopsy report noted that his body was so entirely broken down that he did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs, his intestines, rotten and gangrenous. Slowly, quietly, collapsed in on himself, taking the entire Spanish Habsburg dynasty down with him. A gentle, tragic end to a family that just couldn't bear to look outside its own castle for a date. Speaking of dietary tragedies, let's float away from the dusty heat of Spain. Let's drift north, up to the freezing, dark winters of Sweden in the 18th century. We are going to look at King Adolf Frederick. Adolf Frederick was not an inbred genetic disaster. He was just a guy. He was a relatively weak king. Politically speaking, the Swedish parliament held all the actual power. So Adolf essentially just spent his days stamping documents and trying to find ways to entertain himself in the dark, snowy isolation of Stockholm. He was famously good-natured, a soft, round man who loved makings. He would sit for hours, meticulously crafting little wooden boxers, avoiding any real royal responsibilities. But what Adolf Frederick really loved, more than ruling, more than snuff boxes, was eating. Now, royals dying from eating too much isn't entirely uncommon. Henry I of England famously died from eating a surfeit of lampreys, which are those terrifying, blood-sucking, eel-like fish. Why anyone would eat even one lamprey is a mystery, let alone a surfeit of them. But Adolf Frederick's end was much more spectacular and deeply focused on pastries. It was February 12, 1771. A Tuesday, the king sat down for a traditional pre-Lenten feast. It started reasonably enough for a royal dinner. He had some lobster. He had some caviar. He had kippers, sauerkraut, and boiled meats. He washed it all down with a healthy amount of champagne. He was full. A normal person would have stopped there, retired to a velvet chair, and taken a nap. But Adolf Frederick was not a normal person. He was a bored king with a massive sweet tooth. It was time for dessert. In Sweden, there is a traditional pastry called a semla, is a cardamom-spiced wheat bun, hollowed out and filled with a thick, rich almond paste and topped with heavy whipped cream. It is dense. It is heavy. It sits in your stomach like a delicious, creamy brick. The traditional way to eat it back then was called het vege, which meant placing the bun in a bowl of warm, steaming milk. Adolf ate one. It was delightful. Then he ate a second one. The courtiers standing around the room, strictly forbidden from speaking unless spoken to, probably just watched with mild, blank expressions. Then he ate a third, and a fourth. Que bet going, because when you are the king of Sweden, and you have absolutely zero political power and a profound sense of boredom, no one is allowed to tell you that you've had enough hot milk and almond paste. He ate 14 of them, 14 bowls of steaming milk, 14 heavy wheat buns, mounds of almond paste and cream. He finished the 14th, likely let out a very soft, very tired sigh, and announced that he had a slight stomach ache. He went to his chambers. And then, quite simply, his digestive system gave up. The sheer volume of expanding bread, rich dairy, and champagne caused a massive, fatal digestive failure. He didn't scream. He didn't thrash about. He just slipped into an absolute, irreversible food coma and passed away. It is perhaps the most peaceful, most ridiculous, and softest royal death in history. He literally just ate himself to sleep, permanently. We'll pause here. Let the image of 14 empty pastry bowls sitting in a quiet, snowy Swedish palace slowly fade out. Let's start at the very beginning. The moment a royal baby was born, they were immediately subjected to the absolute height of medieval medical science, which is to say, they were subjected to a lot of very aggressive, very confident guessing. The first thing they did was swaddle the child. Now, modern swaddling is gentle. It's meant to make a baby feel secure. Medieval swaddling was structural engineering. The doctors of the era genuinely believed that infants were essentially made of soft clay. They thought that if you let a baby move its arms or kick its legs, it would naturally grow crooked. It would just sort of bend out of shape, like a warm candle. So, the solution was to bind them. They would take the royal heir, lay them flat on a wooden board, and wrap them from the neck down in tight linen strips. They wrapped the arms flat against the sides. They wrapped the legs straight down. They would wrap them so tightly that the baby literally could not move a single muscle. They were essentially tiny, angry, royal mummies. They would leave the baby like this for months. Sometimes they would hang the swaddled baby on a peg on the wall to keep them away from the drafty floors and the dogs. Just imagine a beautifully decorated, tapestried nursery, completely silent, except for the muffled, frustrated squeaks of a future King of England who is currently hanging on a coat hook, completely immobilized. And because they were royals, the swaddling bands weren't just simple cloth. They were embroidered with gold thread, because if your infant is going to be strapped to a plank of wood for 6 months, you want to make sure the wood is wrapped in the highest quality silk available. It was luxury and misery, perfectly blended. Once the child finally survived infancy and was allowed to bend their knees, the situation didn't get much better. As soon as a royal boy could walk, they were dressed exactly like their fathers. For a medieval prince, this meant velvet doublets, tight hose, and heavily starched collars that scratched their necks. But it also meant armor, because why not double down on the discomfort? It was highly fashionable for kings to commission miniature, fully functional suits of plate armor for their 5-year-old sons. These weren't toys. They were made of real, tempered steel. They had articulating joints, heavy breastplates, and full helmets with visors that could be pulled down. A child's suit of armor could weigh anywhere from 10 to 15 pounds, which doesn't sound like a lot to an adult, but when you are 4 years old and weigh 40 pounds, wearing 15 pounds of steel is a serious athletic commitment. The idea was to get the boy used to the weight of his future responsibilities. Literally, they wanted him to learn how to walk, sit, and eventually ride a very small, very confused pony while entirely encased in metal. You can just picture these royal You have 2 toddlers, maybe 5 or 6 years old, waddling around a stone courtyard like tiny, shiny penguins. They can barely bend their arms. If they fall over, they are completely helpless. They just lay there in the dirt, trapped in their expensive steel shells, waiting for a group of exhausted courtiers to rush over and hoist them back upright. And they weren't just given armor. They were given weapons. Real ones. Take Louis XIII of France. For example, we know a ridiculous amount about his childhood because his royal physician, a man named Jean Hérode, kept him a daily diary of the boy's entire life. Hérode recorded everything, every meal, every temper tantrum, every single time the prince used the chamber pot. It is a deeply invasive historical document. From this diary, we know that little Louis was given a fully functional miniature crossbow when he was just 3 years old. He would wander the halls of the Louvre, a highly irritable toddler, armed with a projectile weapon, shooting at the tapestries, shooting at the birds in the garden, and occasionally shooting at his servants. Because when you are the future absolute monarch of France, and you throw a tantrum, people don't give you a timeout. They give you a loaded weapon and a pat on the head, and they just hope you aim away from their faces. It was an environment perfectly designed to create a deeply spoiled, highly dangerous adult. But what happens when the tiny, heavily armed tyrant actually needs to be disciplined? This was a massive philosophical problem for medieval courts. According to the divine right of kings, a monarch was appointed directly by God. Therefore, the monarch's body was sacred. You could not strike a king, and by extension, you could not strike a prince. If a tutor slapped the future King of England for not doing his Latin homework, that tutor could technically be charged with treason and lose a hand, or worse. But royal children were, quite frankly, awful. They were spoiled, arrogant, and entirely unchecked. They needed discipline. Entered the whipping boy. This is perhaps one of the most bizarre and psychologically damaging institutions of the medieval and early modern court. A whipping boy was a young boy, usually of noble birth, who was chosen to be the constant companion of the young prince. They grew up together. They shared meals. They shared lessons. They played together. They were often best friends. But the whipping boy had one very specific, very terrible job description. Whenever the prince misbehaved, if he refused to study, if he threw his porridge at a servant, if he shot a courtier with a miniature crossbow, prince was not punished. The whipping boy was. The logic was brilliantly, painfully twisted. The tutors figured that since the prince and the whipping boy were best friends, the prince would feel a deep, empathetic, emotional pain seeing his friend beaten. They assumed that the royal conscience would kick in, and the prince would start behaving just to save his buddy from being flogged. Sometimes this actually worked. The young Edward VI of England, the sickly, pale son of Henry VIII, had a whipping boy named Barnaby Fitzpatrick. Edward was a quiet, highly educated, and deeply serious child. He and Barnaby were very close. When Edward acted out, Barnaby took the hits, and it seems Edward genuinely hated seeing it happen, which kept him in line. But let's be honest about human nature, especially the nature of spoiled, untouchable royalty. For a lot of these princes, the whipping boy system didn't teach empathy. It just taught them that actions have zero personal consequences. Imagine being a particularly mean-spirited 7-year-old duke. You realize very quickly that you can break a priceless vase, refuse to learn your math, and generally act like a complete monster. And the only thing that happens is that the kid sitting next to you gets hit with a birch rod. Instead of a moral lesson, it became a spectator sport. It was a completely unhinged psychological experiment playing out in the dark, quiet corners of the royal schoolroom. The whipping boys who survived this process often grew up to be richly rewarded with lands and titles, sort of delayed compensation package for a childhood filled with vicarious trauma. But the emotional damage of literally taking the physical beatings for a divine ruler's bad mood is something they probably carried for the rest of their lives. If the physical realities of royal childhood were grim, the political realities were downright absurd. A royal child was not a person. They were an asset. They were a walking, talking, occasionally drooling peace treaty. And this meant that their romantic lives were sorted out long before they even knew what romance was. Let's look at the strange, sad world of the toddler betrothal. It was incredibly common for a king to arrange the marriage of his daughter when she was only 2 or 3 years old. Sometimes, the marriage contract was signed before the child was even born. 2 rival kings would sit down at a heavy oak table, sign a piece of parchment, and casually agree that whoever was born next would be shipped across the continent in a decade to marry a total stranger. And they didn't just sign a contract. They held proxy weddings. Imagine being a 3-year-old princess. You are wearing a heavy, jewel-encrusted dress that weighs more than you do. You are standing in a freezing, cavernous cathedral, surrounded by hundreds of adults staring at you. You are there to get married, but your groom is currently in Spain, or Austria, or Scotland. He might be 4 years old himself, or he might be... It didn't matter. Because the groom couldn't be there, he sent an ambassador to stand in for him. This was the proxy. So, you have a terrified toddler holding hands with a 45-year-old, heavily bearded foreign diplomat who smells like wet wool and stale wine. The bishop says the vows, the ambassador speaks for the absent groom, and suddenly, the 3-year-old is officially the queen consort of a country she can't even point to on a map. It was a completely surreal pantomime of adulthood. Sometimes, after the proxy wedding, the child was immediately packed up and sent to live in her new husband's court. These raising the child in their new country's customs. But really, it was just a highly decorated hostage situation. Mary, Queen of Scots, was sent to France when she was just 5 years old to be raised alongside her future husband, Francis. She took her favorite toys, a massive retinue of Scottish lords, and 4 little girls who were all also named Mary, just to make things as confusing as possible. She grew up in a foreign court, away from her mother, fully aware that her only actual value was her ability to eventually produce an heir and cement an alliance. And then there were the tragedies of the road, because dragging a small, vulnerable child across medieval Europe was a terrible idea. Take Joan of England, the daughter of King Edward III. In 1348, when Joan was just 14, she was packed off to Spain to marry the son of the King of Castile. It was a massive, glorious procession. She traveled with huge chests of gold, expensive gowns, and a personal, heavily armed guard. But they made the trip in 1348, which was exactly when the Black Death decided to roll through Europe. Joan and her massive, slow-moving, highly noticeable royal entourage walked right into the middle of the worst pandemic in human history. They stopped in a French village to rest. The villagers warned them that the plague was there, but the royal commanders, arrogant and assuming that disease wouldn't dare touch a princess of England, refused to turn back. Within days, her guards started dropping, then her ladies-in-waiting, and finally, sitting alone in a heavily draped, infected tent, miles from home, young Joan caught the plague and quietly passed away. She never made it to Spain. She never met her husband. She was just a pawn moved to the wrong square at the worst possible time. It's a very quiet, very sad kind of history. The lives of these kids were completely out of their own hands. They were strapped to wooden boards, stuffed into steel armor, beaten by proxy, and shipped across oceans like expensive furniture, all to satisfy the massive, fragile egos of the adults around them. We are going to pause right there. Let the heavy oak doors of the nursery slowly pull shut, leaving the tiny suits of armor standing empty in the dark. To understand the royal obsession with cosmetics, we have to understand their absolute terror of the sun. For most of human history, having a tan was not a sign that you had just returned from a relaxing vacation in the south of France. It was a sign that you were poor. It meant you worked outside, in the dirt, doing manual labor. If you had freckles or color in your cheeks, it meant you were a peasant. The ultimate status symbol, therefore, was looking like you had never seen the sun in your entire life. The elite wanted to look like ghosts. They wanted a complexion that was entirely flat, completely white, and completely devoid of any natural human warmth. It was a very quiet, very deliberate way of saying, I am so rich that I have never once had to step outside my own castle. But genetics don't always cooperate with social climbing. People get flushed. People get blemished. People go outside for a 5-minute walk in the garden and accidentally get a little bit of color. So they turn to chemistry. And medieval and Renaissance chemistry was, essentially, just a collection of very bad ideas written down in expensive leather books. The absolute gold standard for achieving that perfectly dead, aristocratic pallor was a substance called Venetian Cerusse. It was also sometimes known as the spirits of Saturn, which honestly should have been the first warning sign that this was not a healthy skincare product. The recipe for Venetian Cerusse was surprisingly simple. You took pure lead, shaped it into little plates, and you soaked those plates in highly concentrated vinegar. You would leave it sitting in a warm place for a few weeks until the lead started to corrode and form a thick, white crust. Then you scraped that toxic crust off, ground it into a very fine powder, and mixed it with a little bit of water or egg white to create a paste. And then you just smeared it all over your face. It was a brilliant cosmetic. Functionally speaking, it provided a thick, opaque, flawlessly white coverage. It smoothed out wrinkles and hid blemishes perfectly. You didn't look like you had good skin. You looked like you were made of freshly poured porcelain. But it was, of course, entirely lethal. Lead is a heavy metal. It absorbs directly through the skin and accumulates in the body. It doesn't leave, it just builds up, year after year, quietly shutting down your nervous system. The irony of Venetian Cerusse was a tragic, self-fulfilling loop. The lead would slowly eat away at the skin, causing severe scarring, dryness, and a grayish, sickly discoloration. So, when a royal woman took her makeup off at the end of the week, she would find that her skin looked objectively worse than it had before. Her solution? Put on a thicker layer of Cerusse to hide the new damage. Because why not double down on the heavy metals? The most famous victim of this slow, quiet vanity trap was Queen Elizabeth I of England. When Elizabeth was young, she was famous for her natural complexion. But in 1562, when she was 29 years old, she contracted smallpox. It was a terrifying, violent illness that swept through the court. Elizabeth survived, which was a miracle in itself, but the disease left her with permanent, deep pockmarks all over her face. For a queen whose entire political brand was built on the idea of the Virgin Queen, a flawless, ageless, semi-divine figure having visible facial scars was simply not an option. So, she turned to the Cerusse. She began applying it every single day. And she didn't just put on a light dusting. She painted it on. She created what historians call the mask of youth. As she got older, the layers got thicker. She wanted to look entirely static, like a living painting. But the daily application of lead was slowly destroying her. Her hair began to fall out, which is why she famously wore those towering, elaborate red wigs. The lead poisoning also attacked her gums, causing her teeth to rot and turn black. Eventually, it became a trend in the English court to casually blacken your own teeth with soot, just so the queen wouldn't feel bad about her highly toxic dental decay. That is the absolute peak of sycophantic behavior. You are literally painting your teeth black so your boss doesn't feel self-conscious about her heavy metal poisoning. Elizabeth would leave the ceruse on for a week at a time, and when she finally took it off, the removal process was almost as damaging as the makeup itself. She used a mixture made of rose water, eggshells, and alum, which is a chemical astringent that basically peels the top layer of your skin off. In her final years, the Queen's court became a very sad, very quiet place. She refused to allow mirrors in any of her rooms. She would just sit in the dim light, covered in a thick layer of white lead, slowly fading away from the inside out, completely trapped in the terrifying, toxic image she had created for herself. We are going to float away from England now. Let's drift south, down to the warm, beautiful, completely chaotic city-states of Renaissance Italy. Because while the English were poisoning their skin, the Italians were busy poisoning their eyes. In the 16th century, there was a very specific standard of beauty for women. You needed to look soft, innocent, and perpetually slightly surprised. The aesthetic goal was to have massive, dilated pupils, which mimicked the natural biological response of being deeply in love or highly aroused. But you can't just command your pupils to dilate on cue for a dinner party. You need chemical assistance. Enter a plant called Atropa belladonna. The name itself literally translates to beautiful lady in Italian, but its common English name is deadly nut. It is one of the most toxic plants in the Eastern Hemisphere. Eating even a couple of its sweet, dark berries will stop your heart. The aristocratic women of Venice and Florence would take the juice of this highly lethal plant, water it down slightly, and drop it directly into their own eyeballs. It worked perfectly. The toxic compounds in the nightshade would paralyze the muscles in the iris, causing the pupil to dilate massively. It gave them that huge, dark, doe-eyed look that poets were constantly writing sonnets about, but the side effects were exactly what you would expect when you drop raw poison into your optical nerve. The drop severely blurred their vision. They couldn't focus on anything closer than 10 feet away. It elevated their heart rates, caused terrible dry mouth, and if used long enough, it caused permanent blindness. Just imagine the reality of a high society Renaissance ball. You have a room full of incredibly wealthy, heavily perfumed aristocrats, all wandering around a dimly lit palazzo, entirely unable to see where they are going. They are tripping over heavy velvet gowns, accidentally walking into walls, and squinting blindly at the Duke of Milan, all in the name of looking softly, innocently beautiful. It was a completely ridiculous, self-inflicted disability. Just a room full of people quietly hallucinating and losing their vision, holding onto the walls, hoping someone would hand them a glass of wine. This obsession with toxic beauty didn't end with the Renaissance. It just kept quietly rolling forward through the centuries. Let's just glide into the 18th century for one last, very sad story. Let me introduce you to Maria Coventry, the Countess of Coventry. In the 1750s, Maria was essentially the it girl of London society. She and her sister were Irish aristocrats who moved to England and became famous simply for being incredibly, breathtakingly beautiful. Crowds would literally form in the streets just to watch them walk by. But Maria was deeply, tragically vain. And the standard of beauty had shifted again. You didn't just need white skin anymore. You needed perfectly rosy cheeks and bright red lips to contrast with the ghostly So, Maria used Venetian ceruse for the white foundation, and for the red blush, she used a compound called cinnabar. Sounds like a lovely, warm spice you might put in a winter tea. It is not. Cinnabar is the bright red ore of mercury. It is highly toxic. So Maria was layering lead over her entire face, and then heavily dusting her cheeks and lips with raw mercury. She was basically a walking thermometer of lethal vanity. Her husband, the Earl of Coventry, actually hated her makeup. He was one of the few people who realized it was completely destroying her health. We have historical accounts of the Earl chasing Maria around the dinner table at a high society banquet with a damp napkin, trying to physically scrub the toxic red mercury off her cheeks. But Maria just waited until he was distracted, went back up to a dressing room, and plastered more of it on. The heavy metals did exactly what heavy metals do. The lead ate away at her skin and attacked her nervous system. The mercury poisoned her blood. And her organs segregate. Her digestive system failed, and she was entirely bedridden. Even on her deathbed, she refused to stop. As her skin turned gray and began to peel, she just demanded that the servants bring her thicker and thicker layers of the white lead. She eventually ordered the curtains to be drawn completely closed, and she lay in the pitch black, refusing to let even her doctors see her face without the makeup. She died in 1760. She was only 27 years old. The society papers called it a death by vanity, a very quiet, very unnecessary end to a life entirely consumed by a mirror. And that is where we will finally leave them. The sad, sickly kings, sitting in the dark with their unchewed food. The exhausted medieval guilds, pushing their broken wooden wagons through the mud. The terrified toddlers standing in freezing cathedrals, marrying strangers by proxy. And the beautiful, tragic queens, slowly poisoning themselves in the shadows of their own dressing rooms. It is a long, strange, and deeply flawed history. But beneath all the gold leaf, the velvet, and the heavy crowns, it is just a story about very human people with very fragile egos, trying incredibly hard to maintain control over a world that was entirely chaotic. They failed, of course. They almost always failed. But they failed in such spectacular, weirdly specific ways that we get to sit here, centuries later, in the warm, quiet comfort of the modern world, and softly marvel at their absolute dedication to the bizarre. Let the image of the dimly lit vanity mirror slowly fade away. Let the heavy, toxic white powder turn back to dust. The castles are quiet now. The court has gone to sleep, and so should you. Take a deep breath. Let the strange, sad ghosts of history wander back into the dark where they belong. There is nothing left to worry about tonight. Just close your eyes and let it all go. Good night. We are looking at the life of Charles Dickens. Now, when most people hear that name, they think of cozy fireplaces, plum puddings, and snowy Victorian Christmases. They think of a very moral, very upstanding gentleman who just wanted everyone to be nice to orphans. But the reality of Charles Dickens was deeply, deeply weird. He was an absolute ball of anxious, neurotic energy. He was a man who wrote endlessly about the sanctity of the perfect, peaceful domestic family, but who was, in his own personal life, essentially a walking emotional meltdown. He was obsessive. He was highly irritable. And he had a personal life so messy it makes modern celebrity gossip look completely dull. Let's say, just drift back to the beginning. Let's float over to the south coast of England, to the year 8. Charles was born into a family that was, to put it mildly, financially illiterate. His father, John Dickens, was a clerk in the Navy Pay Office. It was a good, solid, respectable middle-class job. But John Dickens had a fundamental, almost biological inability to understand how money worked. He was the kind of guy who would realize he couldn't afford to pay the monthly rent. And so, to cheer himself up, he would go out and buy a very expensive, totally unnecessary set of silver spoons. Because why not double down on the aesthetic while the ship is sinking? John loved throwing parties. He loved fine wine. He loved acting like a minor aristocrat, despite having the salary of a mid-level bureaucrat. Charles's mother, Elizabeth, was entirely complicit in this. She was a slightly frantic, deeply impractical woman who mostly just tried to keep up appearances while the debt collectors literally knocked on the front door. So little Charles grew up in a state of constant, quiet panic. The family was always moving. They would rent a nice house, live in it until the local butchers and bakers realized they were never going to get paid. And then the Dickens family would pack up their things in the middle of the night and quietly scurry away to a slightly smaller, slightly cheaper house in another town. It was a childhood defined by the slow, inevitable approach of financial ruin. And Charles, who was a deeply sensitive, highly dramatic little boy, absorbed every single ounce of that anxiety. Eventually, the math caught up with John Dickens. In 1824, when Charles was 12 years old, his father's creditors finally lost their patience. John was arrested for debt and sent to the Marshalsea debtors' prison in London. Now, a Victorian debtors' prison was a very bizarre institution. It wasn't a dungeon with chains. It was essentially a very sad, very poorly maintained apartment complex for people who couldn't pay their bills. If you had a little bit of money from outside friends, you could rent a nicer room. You could buy beer at the prison pub. And, most importantly, you could bring your family to live with you. So John's wife, Elizabeth, packed up the youngest children, grabbed whatever furniture hadn't been pawned yet, and casually moved into the prison. They just set up a little domestic life behind a massive brick wall, topped with iron spikes. It was entirely surreal. But there wasn't enough room in the prison cell for Charles. A wastrel, which in Victorian terms meant he was practically a middle-aged man who needed to get a job. So while his family was having a slightly cramped but relatively cozy time sitting around the fire in a prison cell, Charles was sent to work. He was placed in Warren's blacking factory. Peace is the defining trauma of Charles Dickens's life. Let's just sit in the factory for a moment. It was a crumbling, rat-infested warehouse right on the edge of the River Thames. The river in the 1820s was basically an open sewer, so the smell was absolutely overwhelming. It smelled of rotting mud, raw sewage, and the harsh, chemical sting of shoe polish. Charles S.'s job was entirely mindless. He sat at a wooden table in the freezing cold for 10 hours a day. He would take a small, earthenware pot of shoe, polish the blacking, tie a piece of oil paper over the top, tie a string around it, and then clip off the edges of the paper to make it look neat. Then he pasted a paper label on the front. Pot after pot. Hour after hour. Day after day. For a kid who considered himself to be highly intelligent, a boy who dreamed of being a gentleman and going to a fine school, this was absolute, soul-crushing agony. He was working alongside tough, working-class boys who called him the young gentleman to mock his polite accent. He felt completely abandoned. He felt like his family had just tossed him away into the damp, dark underbelly of London while they hung out in jail. He only worked there for about a year before his father inherited a small amount of money, paid his debts, and was released. But that single year broke something fundamental inside Charles. Or, perhaps, it built something terrifying, and never forgot the smell of the paste. He never forgot the squeak of the rats under the floorboards. And he never, ever forgave his mother. Because when John Dickens got out of prison, he wanted Charles to quit the factory and go back to school. But Elizabeth, ever the practical, slightly cold-hearted manager of the household budget, argued that Charles was bringing in a perfectly good 6 shillings a week, and maybe he should just stay at the factory. Charles never got over the fact that his mother wanted to leave him gluing labels on pots. It gave him a lifelong, deeply ingrained fear of poverty, and a very weird, very complicated relationship with women in general. But he went to school for a bit, learned shorthand, and eventually became a journalist, sitting in the gallery of the House of Commons, furiously writing down the incredibly boring speeches of British politicians. And because he was Charles Dickens, and because he had a terrifying amount of nervous energy, he didn't just become a journalist. He became the best, fastest shorthand reporter in London. He simply outworked everyone else, entirely fueled by the lingering terror of the blacking factory. But all of that success didn't make him relaxed. If anything, it made him weirder. Let's talk about his daily routine, because it is exhausting just to think about. Once he became a famous novelist, Dickens developed a set of deeply quirky, obsessive-compulsive habits. First of all, his study had to be perfectly arranged. He couldn't write a single word unless every object on his desk was in its exact, mathematically precise location. He had a specific set of little bronze ornaments, a rabbit sitting on a leaf, a couple of fat toads, and a dog that had to be lined up just so. If a servant moved the bronze toad by half an inch while dusting, Dickens would have a complete, quiet, internal meltdown until he fixed it. He was also obsessed with his own appearance. He was a deeply vain man. He loved brightly colored waistcoats, heavily oiled hair, and flashy jewelry. He would comb his hair dozens of times a day. We have accounts from people who worked with him who said he would just stand in front of a mirror, staring at himself with total, unblinking intensity, brushing his hair for 10 minutes straight, entirely ignoring anyone else in the room. But his most famous, most intense habit was the walking. Dickens was not a casual stroller. He was a fervent, aggressive pedestrian. He couldn't turn his brain off. He was constantly dreaming up characters, twisting plots, and worrying about his bank account. So, to bleed off some of that frantic energy, he walked. He would frequently walk 15 to 20 miles in a single day. And he walked fast. His friends complained that going for a walk with Charles was essentially a forced athletic march. He would stride along the muddy, unpaved roads of the countryside, his coat flapping in the wind, a grim, determined look on his face, while his friends trailed behind, panting and miserable. But the daytime walks weren't the weird part. It was the night walks, when he was suffering from insomnia, which was often because, again, his brain was essentially a Victorian steam engine running completely out of control. He would simply get out of bed at 2 in the morning, put on his boots, and walk out the door into the pitch black of London. Imagine him, a wealthy, famous, highly respectable Victorian author, just marching rapidly through the worst, most dangerous slums of the city at 3 a.m. He would walk through the damp, creeping fog. He would pass the homeless sleeping in doorways. He would peer into the windows of late-night taverns. He would just wander the empty, echoing cobblestone streets for hours, moving like a ghost, soaking up the misery and the shadows of the city so he could put them into his next book. It once wrote that he felt he had to tame the city by walking it into submission. It wasn't exercise, it was an exorcism. He was just a wealthy, deeply traumatized man trying to outwalk the memory of the blacking factory in the middle of the night. And when he finally did go home, to his beautifully furnished, perfectly arranged house, he expected absolute, total perfection from his family. Which brings us to the very messy, very uncomfortable reality of his domestic life. But we will pause right there for a moment. Let the image of Charles pacing frantically through the thick London fog slowly fade away into the dark. Now, let's follow him back home. Let's step inside the heavy, mahogany-filled, perfectly arranged house of the Dickens family. Because if there is one thing Charles Dickens loved writing about, it was the perfect, glowing, happy Victorian hearth. He practically invented the modern concept of the cozy family Christmas. But living with the man was entirely different. Living with Charles was like living with a highly demanding, emotionally volatile theater director who expected you to hit your marks perfectly, 24 hours a day. Let us talk about his wife, Catherine. Charles married Catherine Hogarth in 1836. At the time, she was young, pretty, and wonderfully calm. And Charles, who was a vibrating ball of nervous energy, probably thought that having a calm wife would be soothing. But he fundamentally misunderstood his own personality. He didn't want a soothing presence. He wanted an audience. And he wanted an audience that could keep up with his frantic, exhausting pace. Catherine could not keep up. Honestly, no normal human being could have. Over the course of their marriage, Catherine was pregnant roughly 14 times. She had 10 surviving children. She spent basically 15 years of her life in a constant state of Victorian confinement, which usually meant lying on a sofa in a dark room, feeling terribly unwell. As the years went by, Catherine understandably gained weight, became clumsy, and was perpetually exhausted. And Charles, instead of looking at his wife and realizing that maybe having 10 children in a row is quite tiring, decided that her exhaustion was a personal insult to his vibrant lifestyle. He became incredibly resentful of her. He would write letters to his friends complaining about Catherine's sluggishness. He actually blamed her for the fact that they had so many children. He would write things like, "It is a great misery to me that Catherine keeps having these children," which is a very specific, deeply unhinged kind of Victorian male audacity. He spoke about his own expanding family as if it were a strange, unpreventable weather event that was happening exclusively to him. It was essentially the ultimate demanding roommate. He required absolute silence when he was writing, but absolute, glowing, energetic adoration the moment he stepped out of his study. And poor Catherine was just too tired to provide it. So Charles looked elsewhere for his ideal woman, and he didn't look very far. In fact, he looked directly at Catherine's younger sisters. This is where the story gets deeply, uncomfortably weird. Shortly after Charles and Catherine were married, Catherine's 16-year-old sister, Mary Hogarth, moved in with them. This wasn't entirely uncommon in the Victorian era, But Charles's reaction to Mary was everything Catherine wasn't. Mostly because Mary was a teenager with zero responsibilities. She was bright, energetic, and completely idolized Charles. To Charles, she was the perfect, pure, angelic Victorian maiden. But in 1837, tragedy struck. Mary came home from a night at the theater, suddenly collapsed from what was likely an undiagnosed heart condition, and died right there in Charles's arms. She was only 17. Charles's grief was absolute, and it was theatrical. He took a ring off Mary's finger and slid it onto his own, vowing to wear it for the rest of his life. And he did. He took all of her clothes out of her closet and kept them, pulling them out occasionally to just stare at them. He demanded that when he died, he must be buried in the exact same grave as Mary. Not his wife, mind you. His teenage sister-in-law, Catherine, just had to sit there, heavily pregnant, watching her husband openly mourn her younger sister as the one true, perfect love of his life. It was a completely miserable, quietly toxic dynamic, playing out in a house filled with heavy velvet curtains and ticking grandfather clocks. When Mary died, Charles eventually needed another pure, energetic maiden to idolize. So, years later, Catherine's other sister, Georgina, moved in. Georgina never married. She just stayed in the Dickens household, managing the servants, raising the children that Catherine was too exhausted to manage, and acting as Charles's constant, adoring companion. Because why not just slowly replace your wife with a newer, less tired version of her own family? But the Hogarth sisters weren't the only bizarre additions to the Dickens household. Let's float away from the incredibly awkward family dinners for a moment and talk about the family pet. Because if you are a brooding, eccentric Victorian genius, you don't just get a golden retriever, you get a raven. In 1840, Charles was writing a novel called Barnaby Rudge, which featured a talking raven. To get the details right, Charles decided he needed to study one in real life. So he bought a massive, aggressive raven and named it Grip. Grip was not a good pet. Grip was a menace. A was allowed to roam freely around the house and the garden, which meant that Dickens' children lived in a state of constant, low-level terror. Gripper was highly territorial. If a child walked past him, Grit would lunge out and violently peck at their ankles. He terrorized the family dogs, stealing their food and barking at them in perfectly mimicked human voices. Grip also had a very destructive palate. He loved to destroy the house. He would pull the mortar out of the brick walls, he would peel the veneer off the furniture, and, most fatally, he developed a deep, inexplicable craving for lead paint. One day, Charles was having the house repainted. Grip, being a bird of deeply refined tastes, found a discarded can of white lead paint and just started drinking it. Unsurprisingly, drinking heavy metals is not good for avian digestion. Grip, grip, Betty Hill. Charles, who loved the bird far more than he loved most of his own children, was devastated. He called in a human doctor to treat the raven. The doctor recommended keeping Grip warm and giving him a little bit of castor oil. Grip rallied briefly, managed to bite one last servant, and then politely dropped dead. But Charles couldn't just let Grip go. He had the bird professionally He mounted Grip in a glass case, surrounded by fake branches, and put the case right in his study, where the dead bird could stare at him with flat glass eyes, while he wrote, "Who's imagined the vibe of this house? You have a perpetually exhausted wife, a fiercely loyal sister-in-law, 10 terrified children, and a deeply neurotic father sitting in his perfectly arranged study, staring at a stuffed raven that died from eating paint." It is a masterpiece of domestic dysfunction. But Charles's weirdness wasn't just confined to his family and his pets. He also developed a very strange, very intense hobby. Let's drift into T. 1840 segundos. This was the era of mesmerism, also known as animal magnetism. It was the Victorian precursor to hypnotism, and it was wildly popular among the elite. The theory was that every human body had an invisible magnetic fluid, and that a strong-willed person could manipulate that fluid in a weaker person, putting them into a trance and curing their physical and mental ailments. Charles Dickens absolutely loved mesmerism, because of course he did. It was a pseudoscience entirely based on the idea that a powerful, charismatic man could simply wave his hands and completely control the mind of someone else. It played perfectly into his massive ego. A learned how to do it, and he decided he was an absolute master of the craft. He started hypnotizing everyone. He hypnotized his friends at dinner parties. He would stand in front of them, staring deeply into their eyes, making slow, sweeping magnetic passes with his hands, trying to put them to sleep. Sometimes it worked, mostly because his friends were probably just incredibly bored or desperate to escape the conversation. He frequently hypnotized his wife, Catherine, which, if you think about it, is both hilarious and deeply sad. Charles would proudly tell his friends that he could put Catherine into a deep trance within minutes. But given that Catherine was chronically exhausted and trying to manage 10 children, it's highly likely she wasn't being magically magnetized. She was probably just incredibly grateful for the excuse to close her eyes and take a nap, without Charles yelling at her for being sluggish. But Charles's amateur medical career reached its absolute uncomfortable peak when the family traveled to Italy in 1844 while staying in Genoa. Charles met an Englishwoman named Madame de la Rue. Madame de la Rue was a nervous, highly anxious woman who suffered from terrifying hallucinations. She claimed she was being constantly stalked by a phantom that only she could see. She had facial tics, severe insomnia, and dizzy spells. Charles looked at this deeply unwell woman and immediately decided, I can fix her with my hands. A began treating her with daily mesmerism sessions. But he didn't just do it in public. He would go to her hotel room. Sometimes he would go in the middle of the night. If she woke up screaming about the phantom, he would sit with her in the dim, quiet room for hours, holding her hands, waving his arms over her head, putting her into a deep trance. A became entirely obsessed with her subconscious. He wrote pages and pages of notes detailing her hallucinations, treating her mind like it was a fascinating new novel he was writing. And where was Catherine during all of this? She was sitting downstairs in their rented villa, completely furious. Catherine was not a stupid woman. She saw her husband practically running out the door at 1 a.m. to go sit in a dark hotel room with another woman, supposedly to cure her magical phantom stalker by waving his hands over her face. Catherine told Charles that the situation was entirely inappropriate and that it was humiliating her in front of Italian high society. Charles's response was classic deeply defensive Dickens. He basically told Catherine that she was being overly sensitive, completely unscientific, and that it was his absolute moral duty to use his incredible magnetic powers to save this poor woman's brain. He completely dismissed his wife's very valid feelings because his own savior complex was just too strong to ignore. The Italy trip eventually ended, and they left Madame de la Rue behind, though Charles kept writing her letters for years, constantly asking for updates on the phantom. But the damage to his marriage was done. The cracks were getting wider. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the Dickens household was slowly becoming entirely unbreathable. Charles was feeling trapped by his own life, entirely bored by his wife, and constantly looking for the next source of drama, the next spark of energy to keep his Victorian steam engine running. And he was about to find it in the worst, most scandalous way possible. But we will pause right there for a moment. Let the slow, sweeping hand motions of the amateur hypnotist fade into the shadows. Let Catherine finally get some sleep. Let us just drift back to England, to the damp, grey skies of London in the late 1850s. The Dickens household was heavily decorated, perfectly arranged, and completely miserable. Charles was restless. The mesmerism phase was wearing off. The walking wasn't entirely curing his anxiety, and his wife, after 22 years of marriage and 10 surviving children, was simply existing in a state of quiet, sluggish resignation. Charles was 45 years old, and because he was a deeply theatrical Victorian man with a massive, fragile ego, he didn't deal with his midlife crisis by quietly taking up a new hobby. He dealt with it by destroying his entire domestic life with spectacular, public precision. It all started with a play. Charles loved acting almost as much as he loved writing. In 1857, he co-wrote and starred in a melodramatic play called The Frozen Deep. To ensure the production was perfect, he hired a family of professional actresses. Among them was a young woman named Ellen Ternan. Everyone called her Nellie. Nellie was exactly what Charles Dickens was looking for. She was a professional actress, which meant she was entirely comfortable dealing with dramatic, demanding men. She was pretty, she was intelligent, and most importantly, she was 18 years old. She was the exact same age as Charles's own daughter, Kate Butt. Charles didn't care. He was instantly, hopelessly, and completely obsessed. He didn't just have a quiet crush. He reorganized his entire life around this teenager. He moved her into his social circle. He started finding excuses to be away from home. He was a man who had built his entire literary reputation on the absolute sanctity of the domestic hearth, the purity of marriage, and the warm, glowing love of the family unit. And here he was, behaving like a highly agitated, completely smitten. The turning point, the moment where the heavy velvet curtains finally came crashing down on his marriage, happened in the spring of 1858. And it happened because of a jeweler's mistake. Charles had ordered a custom gold bracelet for Nellie. It was a beautiful, expensive piece of jewelry meant to be a secret token of his affection. But the jeweler, entirely unaware of the complex, toxic dynamics of the Dickens household, simply boxed it up and had it delivered to Charles's primary residence. It was handed directly to Catherine Dickens. Who's to imagine the sheer, freezing awkwardness of that moment? Catherine, who was chronically exhausted, opens a velvet box, expecting perhaps a belated anniversary gift or a quiet token of appreciation from her very demanding husband. Instead, she finds a beautiful gold bracelet with an engraved note meant for an 80. When Chazoo found out about the misdelivery, a normal person might have apologized. A normal person might have felt a shred of guilt. Charles Dickens did not feel guilt. He felt annoyed that he had been caught, and his reaction was a masterpiece of cruel, defensive manipulation. He didn't apologize to Catherine. Instead, he told her that it was perfectly normal for a theater manager to give expensive jewelry to his young actresses. And then, he demanded that Catherine get in her carriage, drive to Nellie's house, and personally give her the bracelet, so that Nellie wouldn't feel insulted by any implication of impropriety. The absolute audacity of this man is almost hard to comprehend. He forced his exhausted, heartbroken wife of 2 decades to hand deliver a romantic gift to his teenage mistress simply to protect his own ego. Catherine, completely defeated, did it. She went to the house, handed over the box, and reportedly cried the entire way home. After the bracelet incident, Charles decided he simply couldn't bear to look at his wife anymore. She was a constant, physical reminder of his own hypocrisy. So, he decided to physically separate them. But he didn't just ask her to move into the guest room. Called in the carpenters. While the family was still living in the house, Charles had workmen come into the master bedroom. They carried in stacks of raw bricks, buckets of wet mortar, and heavy trowels. And right there, down the exact center of the bedroom, they built a solid brick wall. It wasn't a metaphor. It was masonry. And incredibly, he kept Catherine's sister, Georgina. Georgina chose to stay with Charles and manage the household, completely turning her back on her own sister. Because why let a perfectly good, highly efficient sister-in-law go to waste? But Charles wasn't done. He was terrified that the public would find out he had left his wife for a teenager, and that it would ruin his brand as the ultimate Victorian moral compass. So, he decided to launch a preemptive strike. He published a front-page open letter in multiple newspapers, including the Times. In this letter, he essentially told the entire British public that the rumors were false, that there was no young lady involved, and that actually the real problem was that Catherine was a terrible mother who had a mental disorder, and that their children had never really liked her anyway. Gaslit his wife on a national scale. It was cruel. It was entirely unnecessary, and it permanently alienated several of his closest friends, who found the public smearing of poor Catherine to be absolutely repulsive. But Charles was free. sort of, and now had his secret life with Nellie. But maintaining a secret life when you are the most famous, most recognizable author in the English-speaking world is exhausting. A couldn't be seen with her in public. So, he set her up in a series of secret cottages outside of London. First, in a place called Slough, and later, in a head to commute to see his own mistress. He would take the train, wearing a hat pulled low over his face. He rented the houses under false names. He went by Mr. Charles Tringham, or sometimes Mr. Imagine the sheer, vibrating anxiety of it all. This was a man who already couldn't sleep. A man who obsessively arranged his bronze toads and walked 20 miles a night. Now, he was playing a deeply stressful high-stakes game of hide-and-seek with the entire British press. He was living a double life. In the city, he was Charles Dickens, the great moralist. In the suburbs, he was Mr. Tringham, a suspiciously wealthy man who visited his very young ward on the weekends. It is widely believed that Nellie and Charles had a child together who died in infancy, though the records were deliberately destroyed. It was a life of quiet desperation, fake names, and burned letters. And the stress of this double life finally culminated in an event that permanently shattered whatever was left of Charles's fragile nervous system. Let's glide forward to June 9, 1865. Charles was returning from a secret trip to France. He was on a boat train heading back to London, and he wasn't alone. He was traveling with Nellie and Nellie's mother. They were sitting in a first-class carriage, likely in tense, quiet conversation, hoping not to be recognized by any of the other wealthy passengers. Day train was moving fast, about 50 miles an hour. As it approached a place called Staplehurst, it reached a viaduct bridge crossing a shallow, muddy river. What the train driver didn't know was that a crew of workmen had removed a massive section of the iron track on the bridge for repairs, and the foreman had forgotten to send a flagman far enough down the line to warn the approaching train. The train hit the gap in the tracks. It was not a loud, fiery explosion. It was a sudden, violent, horrific lurch. The engine and the first few carriages flew entirely off the bridge, crashing down into the muddy riverbed below. The carriage that Charles, Nellie, and her mother were sitting in did not fall. It derailed, skidded off the wooden timbers, and stopped, dangling precariously in mid-air, tilted at a terrifying angle directly over the wreckage and the water below. The silence that followed must have been completely suffocating, broken only by the groaning of the strained wood and the cries from the river. Now, to his credit, Charles Dickens did not panic. At least, not externally. He managed to calm Nellie and her mother down. He climbed out of the dangling carriage window, found a plank of wood, and managed to help them cross to safety. Once they were on solid ground, he told them to leave. He told them to get as far away from the crash site as possible, immediately, because his absolute first priority, even in the middle of a mass casualty event, was making sure no newspaper reporter saw the great Charles Dickens crawling out of a train carriage with his 26-year-old secret mistress. Once Nellie was safely hidden away, Charles went to work. He climbed down into the riverbed. It was a green, terrible scene. 10 people died, and 40 were severely injured. Charles found a top hat, filled it with river water, and spent 3 hours walking among the dying, offering them water and brandy from his personal flask. It was gently, he was efficient, and he was completely, internally, traumatized. But, as the rescue trains finally started to arrive, Charles remembered something. He hadn't just left his luggage in the dangling carriage. He had left his manuscript. He was currently publishing his novel, Our Mutual Friend, in monthly installments, and the only existing copy of the next chapter was sitting in his coat pocket, suspended over a muddy ravine. Because, even in the face of death and destruction, the Victorian publishing deadline waits for no man. So Charles Dickens, a 53-year-old man in a mud-soaked suit, climbed back up the crumbling bridge, carefully lowered himself into the dangerously unstable, dangling carriage, retrieved his manuscript, and climbed back out. He survived the Staplehurst crash without a single physical scratch, but it destroyed him. The trauma of the event fundamentally rewired his brain. He completely lost his voice for 2 weeks. He developed a severe, lingering case of what we would now call PTSD. For the rest of his life, He was terrified of train travel. If he was in a carriage that jolted even slightly, he would grip the armrests in absolute panic, convinced the floor was about to drop out beneath him. Aged decades in the span of a few months. His hair thinned, his face grew lined and gray. He was a man completely exhausted by his own secrets, haunted by the sound of the grinding iron tracks, and entirely unable to stop working. We are going to pause right there. Let the image of the ruined train carriage, suspended in the quiet afternoon air, slowly fade away. Let the mud dry, and let the panic subside. Let's just drift through the last few years of Charles Dickens's life. Following the Staplehurst train crash, Charles was a fundamentally broken man. His nerves were completely shot. His voice was weak. He was secretly supporting a young mistress in a suburban cottage, entirely estranged from his wife, and carrying the heavy, unspoken trauma of watching a train fall apart beneath him. A normal, reasonable person in their mid-50s, with massive wealth and a severe anxiety disorder, would probably retire. They would buy a nice house in the country, sit in a comfortable armchair, and maybe take up a quiet hobby like watercolor painting or competitive napping. But Charles was not normal, and he was completely incapable of resting. Because if there is one thing a Victorian control freak with a fragile ego needs, it is the constant, deafening validation of a live audience. In his final years, Charles decided that simply writing books wasn't enough. He needed to read them aloud. He embarked on massive, exhausting, and incredibly lucrative public reading tours across Britain and the United States. Now, when I say reading, do not picture a distinguished gentleman sitting behind a podium, politely reciting poetry. Charles Dickens essentially put on a one-man, highly athletic theatrical production. He had a special reading desk, built perfectly arranged, of course, with a specific block of wood for him to rest his hand on, a carafe of water, and a very specific arrangement of gas lamps to illuminate his face just right. He didn't just read the dialogue, he acted it out. He would contort his face, change his voice, and physically throw himself around the stage, playing up to 20 different characters in a single night. It was exhausting, and it was destroying his health. But the absolute peak of this self-destructive phase was his obsession with the murder reading. From his novel Oliver Twist, he took the scene where the brutal criminal Bill Sikes murders Nancy. It is a dark, violent, and deeply unpleasant scene. But Charles loved it. He loved it because it terrified people. He would practice it in the fields behind his house, screaming the dialogue into the empty air, probably deeply confusing his neighbor's sheep. When he performed it on stage, he went completely feral. He would practically froth at the mouth. Women in the audience would routinely faint. We have records of him bragging in letters about how many dozen women he managed to render unconscious on a Tuesday night in Edinburgh. It was a bizarre, grim flex, but the physical toll on his own body was catastrophic. Charles actually hired a doctor to stand in the wings off stage to take his pulse the minute he walked off. His resting heart rate was usually around 72. After the murder reading, it would spike to 120 or higher. He would stumble off the stage, completely pale, completely breathless, and practically collapse onto a sofa. His doctors begged him to stop. They told him he was going to have a stroke right there on the wooden stage. But Charles, addicted to the adrenaline and the applause, simply ignored them. He was a man literally performing himself to death, night after night, entirely out of a desperate need to feel alive. By 1867, Charles decided to take his reading tour to America. His health was already entirely ruined. He was suffering from what his doctors vaguely called neuralgia, which essentially just meant his entire left side was in agonizing pain. His left foot swelled up so massively that he couldn't put a shoe on it. So, he crossed the Atlantic in the middle of winter, heavily medicated, limping, and deeply irritable. His daily routine in America was a medical tragedy. He was so sick and so exhausted that he physically could not eat solid food. So, his team put him on a liquid diet designed to keep him standing just long enough to scream at the audience for 2 hours. Let's just look at what he was consuming every day. For breakfast, he would have 2 tablespoons of rum mixed with heavy cream. Not coffee, just dairy and liquor. For lunch, he would drink a pint of champagne. In the late afternoon, to prepare for his performance, his assistants would whip up a raw egg, beat it into a glass of sherry, and hand it to him. He would drink that, drag himself onto the stage, terrify a theater full of Bostonians, and then limp off stage. Before going to bed, he would drink a bowl of hot beef tea, which is essentially just salty meat. Water on, take a massive dose of laudanum, which was liquid opium. Just imagine the sheer toxic misery of this existence. He was the most famous author in the world, sitting in luxurious, velvet-draped hotel rooms across America, entirely unable to eat a piece of bread. He was just surviving on a ghastly slurry of raw eggs, fortified wine, and narcotics. Dragging his swollen foot from city to city, he made a massive fortune on the tour. Of course, but by the time he sailed back to England in 1868, he looked like a ghost. His skin was gray, his hair was thin, and he could barely walk without a cane. The frantic 20-mile midnight walks were a thing of the past. The Victorian steam engine was finally running out of coal. Let's drift back to his home in England, to a place called Gad's Hill Place. When Charles was a little boy, walking with his father before the crushing poverty and the blacking factory, they used to walk past a beautiful, large brick mansion on a hill in Kent. His father told him that if he worked very hard, maybe one day he could live in a house like that. Decades later, Charles actually bought it. Gad's Hill Place was his dream home, and because he was Charles, he immediately started renovating it, micromanaging every single brick, every single doorknob, and perfectly arranging his furniture. To help him write, his actor friend gave him a very strange gift. He gave him a prefabricated Swiss chalet. It was a little wooden cabin that arrived in dozens of heavy crates. Charles had it assembled in the garden, directly across the street from the main house. He even had a tunnel dug under the road, so he could walk from his front door to his little writing cabin without ever having to interact with the general public. It was in this quiet, slightly ridiculous wooden chalet that Charles sat down to write what would be his final novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. It was the spring of 1870. The house was quiet. Catherine was still banished. Georgina was still managing the servants. Nellie was still hidden away in her suburban cottage. Charles would wake up, walk through his private tunnel, climb up to the second floor of the little chalet, and stare out at the trees. He was incredibly frail. His vision was failing, and he was having trouble reading the right side of the page. He was having minor strokes, though he refused to acknowledge them. He just kept dipping his pen in the ink, trying to push through the fog in his brain. On June 8, 1870, Charles spent the entire day in the chalet, working on the 6th installment of Edwin Drood. He wrote a very beautiful, very quiet passage about the morning light shining on the old city of Rochester. He finally set his pen down late in the afternoon, leaving the mystery completely unsolved. He walked back through the tunnel into the main house and sat down for dinner. Let's just stay in this dining room for a moment. Dim the lights down to a single candle. It was just Charles and his sister-in-law, Georgina. The heavy silverware was laid out perfectly. The clock was ticking in the hallway. Throughout dinner, Georgina noticed that Charles looked terrible. He was incredibly pale, and he was struggling to speak clearly. He told her he had a toothache. He tried to eat, but he was entirely disoriented. He mentioned that he wanted to travel to London immediately. He stood up from the table, and then, very quietly, his brain simply gave out. A massive stroke finally caught up with him. He swayed, completely losing his balance. Georgina rushed around the table to catch him. She wrapped her arms around him, trying to hold up the dead weight of this man who had driven her and everyone else around him to absolute exhaustion for decades. "Come and lie down," she told him, trying to guide him to a sofa. Charles looked at her. His final words were not poetic. They were not a grand summary of his literary legacy. He just mumbled, "On the ground," and he collapsed onto the dining room floor. He never regained consciousness. They moved him to a sofa, called the doctors, and sent a frantic, secret message to Nellie Ternan, telling her to come quickly. He lay there in the quiet house, his breathing heavy and shallow, completely unaware of the frantic activity around him. The next evening, exactly 24 hours after he had collapsed, Charles Dickens quietly stopped breathing. He was 58 years old. Now, even in death, Charles tried to micromanage everything. In his will, he left highly specific, incredibly strict instructions for his funeral. He wanted no public announcement of the time or place. He wanted no expensive mourning clothes, no black bows, and absolutely no grand monuments. He explicitly asked to be buried in a small, quiet graveyard near his home in Kent, or, if possible, in the same grave as his teenage sister-in-law, Mary, because he was entirely committed to that weird, uncomfortable obsession until the bitter end. He essentially said, "Just put me in the dirt quietly and leave me alone. But you cannot be the most famous man in the British Empire and expect the British public to respect your boundaries." When the news of his death broke, the entire country went into mourning, and the government, led by Queen Victoria's officials, decided that a quiet country burial simply wasn't grand enough for Charles Dickens. They completely ignored his will. They decided he needed to be buried in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, the most famous, most public, most heavily monumentalized church in the entire world. But, in a weird, half-hearted attempt to compromise with his final wishes, they held the funeral at dawn. Immagine Italiano. It is 9:30 in the morning on a Tuesday. Westminster Abbey is massive, freezing cold, and almost entirely empty. A very small, very tired group of mourners stands around an open hole in the stone floor. Georgina is there. Some of his children are there. Nellie Turnan is strictly forbidden from attending. Catherine, his actual wife of 22 years, is also not there. She simply sent a letter to the family, expressing her sorrow from her lonely house in London. They lowered the heavy oak coffin into the ground. A priest said a few quick words, and that was it. No music, no grand procession. They just dropped the greatest author of the Victorian era into a hole in the floor before the tourists arrived. For the next 3 days, they left the grave open, and thousands upon thousands of people, the readers who loved his cozy Christmas stories and his moralizing tales, filed through the damp abbey to throw flowers down onto the coffin, completely unaware of the miserable, anxious, deeply flawed reality of the man resting inside it. And that is where we will leave him. The frantic, midnight walks are finally over. The heavy brick wall in the bedroom has been torn down. The taxidermy raven is gathering dust in a museum somewhere, entirely forgotten. Charles Dickens was a man who spent his entire life trying to outrun the smell of shoe polish and the terrible, creeping fear of poverty. He built a massive, glittering empire of words, but he completely destroyed the people standing closest to him in the process. He was a genius, absolutely, but he was also just a very tired, very anxious man who didn't know how to stop. But he has stopped now. The ink is completely dry. The stage is empty. There is nothing left to write, and nothing left to worry about. The damp London fog is rolling back in, covering the cobblestones, softening the sharp edges of the city. It is time for you to stop, too. Let the ghosts of the Victorian era wander back into the dark, where they belong. Just take a deep breath, sink a little deeper into the pillow, and let the quiet take over. Good night.
Today we will talk about a very old history topic. This story is from a time when there were no house, no cities, no schools and no books. This is the story of fire. Fire is not just a thing but that burns. Fire changed everything. Fire made human different from animals. Without fire, there would be no food like today, no protection, no progress, and maybe no modern world. This is the story of how fire slowly changed human life step by step. Long, long ago, humans were very weak. They had no clothes, no proper homes, and no weapons. They lived in forest and open land. They were always afraid. Big animals hunted them, cold weather, hot there, dark nights scared them. Human ate raw food. Raw meat was hard to chew. Raw plants were bitter and dangerous. People got sick easily. Many people died young. Life was very hard. the first time humans saw fire. Yes, fire was not first made by human. Fire came from nature. Lighting, heat, trees, volcanoes burned land, dry forest caught fire. Early humans saw fire from far away. They saw bright light. They felt heat. At first, they were scared. Fire was dangerous. Fire burned skin. Fire destroyed trees. But humans are curious. They watched fire carefully. Slowly, humans understood something important. Fire is dangerous, but fire is also useful. Fire give heat, fire give light. People start keeping fire interested of running away. They carried burning wood from natural fire. They portrayed that fire carefully. If fire dead, life became hard again. Fire became like a friend. Fire and warmth. Cold weather was deadly before fire. Winter killed many people. People slept at night. Fire changed this. Fire kept human warmth and people could live in a colder place. They could travel to new lands. Fire helped humans survive winter. This was a very big change in history. Fire and light. Before fire, night was very dark. Darkness brought fear. Wild animal hunted at night. Fire brought light. People could see at night. They could stay together. They could talk and think. This helped humans before social. This helped humans share idea. Fire created community. Fire and protection. Fire carried wild animal. Animal we are afraid of flame. They stayed away from fire. Humans used fire as protection. They slept near fire. This saved many lives. Fire became a side. Fire and cooked food. This was one of the biggest change in human history. Yes, human learned to cook food. Cooked meat was soft. Cooked plant were safe. People became stronger. Their brains grew bigger. Good food gave more energy. Scientists believe cooking helped human become intelligent. Fire helped create the human brain. Fire and tools. Fire helped humans make tools. They hardened wood in fire. They saved stone using heat. Later, fire helped me melt metal. This lead to copper tools. They bronze tools. They iron tools. Fire started technology. Fire and caves. Human lived in caves. Caves were dark and cold. Fire made caves livable. Fire kept animal away. Fire gave light inside cave. Human painted on cave walls using firelight. This was early art. This was early culture. Fire and social life. Fire brought people together. People sat around fire, they talked, they shared stories. This was the beginning of language, this was the beginning of tradition. Fire created human society, learned to make fire. At first, human protected natural fire. Later, they learned to make fire. They rubbed stones, they rubbed wood, This was a huge discovery. Now fire was always available. Human we are no longer dependent on nature. This was the freedom. Fire and migration. Fire allowed humans to move. They went to good lands. They crossed mountains. Fire helped humans to spread across the world, from Africa to Asia, from Asia to Europe, from Europe to everywhere. Fire helped humans conquering that plant. Fire and religion. Religion. Fire became scared. People believe fire was a magic. People worshipped fire. Yes, many religions used fire. Fire rituals started. Fire became a symbol of life. Fire and farming. Fire helped clear forest. People burned land. This made farming possible. Yes, farming changed human life. People settled down. Villages formed and cities we are born. Are you know? Fast start civilization. Fire and industry. Thousands of years later, fire powered machine, fire boiled water, steam and gas were born. Factors started, trains moved, fire became energy. Fire and modern world. Today, fire still help us. Electric comes from fire. Cooking or users use fire. Industries uses fire, and fire still saves human life. Conclusion: fire is not just that the fire is the history. Fire made humans human. Without fire, there would be no civilization, no cities, no technology. Fast is the greatest discovery in human history. This. Thank you. Today, now this is a very interesting story. I am feeling mm, very relaxed now because I am try to very best now. So please subscribe, like, and comment. Thank you.